Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Why is the Premier on his feet?
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for leave to make a statement.
Premier's asked leave to make a personal statement. Is leave granted? Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to members of this Assembly. On Thursday, in response to a question in question period, I provided an example of vendor-sponsored travel by employees of the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency. My response was based on information provided to me that I believed to be accurate at that point in time. Later on Thursday afternoon, I was provided with information that the example that I used was not, in fact, vendor-sponsored travel. In the specific example regarding the purchase and training for a linear accelerator, the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency actually paid for the travel and accommodation, while tuition credits for training radiation therapists were built into the vendor contract. Mr. Speaker, immediately upon discovering this inaccuracy, my office issued a statement to correct the record, and we delivered a letter to the Leader of the Opposition to inform them of this inaccuracy. Mr. Speaker, and to members of this Legislative Assembly, although I believed the information to be accurate at the time of my delivery, I later learned this not to be the case. It was never my intention to mislead this House, and I want to apologize to all members. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
I have a statement by the Speaker. So reflecting on the absence of another member, on Thursday, November 15th, 2018, the Government House Leader raised a very succinct point of order to assert that a question by the Leader of the Opposition contravened 51 sub B. That rule states that a member shall not reflect on the absence of another member. I reviewed the handed record and find no breach of Rule 51 sub B. Therefore, the point of order is not well taken. Introduction of guests, and I've got some guests to begin. Members of the Legislative Assembly, it's my honor today to introduce the 2018 teachers who are participating in the 20th Annual Saskatchewan Teachers Institute on Parliamentary Democracy. The Institute began on Saturday, November 17th and will conclude on Wednesday, November 21st. This group has already had a very busy schedule, meeting with the Judiciary, Election Saskatchewan, the Clerk's Office, caucus staff, the Legislative Library, and the Premier's Office. They're also scheduled to meet with the Minister of Education, caucus chairs, House leaders, and various others over the next 2 days. I would ask that the teachers and guests give us a wave as I introduce them. Carmen Peasley, J.H. Boer Elementary School. Amanda Stesick, James Hamblin School. Kevin Dirtle, Vanscoy School. Kathy Spence, Vanscoy School. Lori Wolke, Riverbend Colony School. Jeff Burton, Engelfeld School. Jeffrey Ness, Hudson Bay Community School. Linda Briggs, Gordon F. Kells High School. Tracy Spence, Success School. Janine Lassan, Esterhazy High School. Gord Earhart, Esterhazy High School. Mark Pittman, Cyberstone Virtual School. Kyle Males, Aberdeen Composite School. Tammy Flaman, Regina Public 4. Avril Skolny, Emerald Ridge Elementary School. Kirk Feig, W.S. Holleruck Elementary School. And Jolene Gulliker, Edenfeld School. I'd like to make a special mention of our steering committee, composed of 3 teachers who have attended past institutes, as well as an official from the Ministry of Education. From the Ministry of Education, Ms. Delise Pittman, the curriculum coach. The steering committee, Ms. Shayna Zubko, Esterhazy High School. Mr. Andrew Kitchen, Fairhaven High School in Saskatoon. And Mr. Riley Sharp, Swift Current Comprehensive High School. I ask all members to welcome the SSTI 2018 participants to their legislature. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you to all members of the Assembly, I'd like to join you in introducing all the teachers and the SSTI Steering Committee members that are participating in the 20th Annual Saskatchewan Teachers Institute on Parliamentary Democracy. Mr. Speaker, teachers will learn some pretty important lessons, I think, with respect to how democracy works, and they'll be able to take those lessons back to their kids in their classroom, Mr. Speaker, which is a valuable lesson for all people to learn, Mr. Speaker. I might also point out that tomorrow morning I'll be answering some questions, Mr. Speaker, from these teachers, and I'm sure that the questions that they're going to answer, or that they'll ask tomorrow, will be at least as good as the questions which I'll answer in question period today, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask all members of the legislature to welcome these teachers to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join you and the Minister in welcoming these teachers from all around the province to their Legislative Assembly today. I want to thank each of you for your commitment to your classrooms, your commitment to professional development, and I hope you have just a fantastic time at the Teachers Institute this week. I look forward to talking with each of you further at the banquet this week, and in the meantime, I hope you ask some great questions of the Minister. I'm always interested to hear what the answers are. With that, I would invite all members to join me in welcoming these teachers to their Legislative Assembly.
I recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to introduce in the West Gallery this afternoon Mr. Todd Brandt. He's the CEO of Tourism Saskatoon. Along with Tourism Saskatchewan, local associations that Todd represents do great work in our province to advocate and do work for a very important sector in our province, the tourism sector. He's here for some meetings this afternoon and a reception we hope all members can attend to this evening. So I would thank Todd for all his work, and it's great to have him here at the Ledge. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I believe I see Barb Deedi, in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon. You would know, Mr. Speaker, you're at the event with myself, along with a member from Saskatoon Centre, the Multicultural Council Saskatchewan Awards. Very deserving award winner. Barb won the Betty Shukowich Award for Lifetime Achievement for all her advocacy work in our province, in the multicultural sphere, and she's been doing that for many years, and I'm sure for many years to come. So welcome her as well this afternoon to the Assembly.
Here. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to join the Minister in welcoming Todd Brandt to his legislature, and of course tourism is a big part of what makes our province click, and particularly Saskatoon. Todd has been a champion of Saskatoon for many years, and I look forward to meeting with Todd and the crew this afternoon at the reception. And as well as the Minister introduced Barb as well, I want to call out a big recognition to Barb Deedi in the work that she's done in multiculturalism here in Saskatchewan. And indeed, we were at that reception and saw her get recognized. Along with her are her nominees that are nominators. Her nominators, Sharon Pepin, if Sharon could give a wave, and Albert Swardeski. And they're the ones who put the package together to make sure that Barb got the recognition that she was due. So I'd ask all members to join in recognizing all the guests in the gallery today. Thank you.
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, I would like to introduce two members in your gallery from my community. First of all, I'd like to recognize Greg Hoffert. Greg Hoffert is the Executive Director of the St. Joseph's Hospital in Estevan. He's also a member of the Estevan City Council, on which I had the privilege of sitting with him on that council. And I like to call him a volunteer extraordinaire, because within our community, he's always there to help out with whatever activity is going on. The most recent one I seen him at was the Habitat for Humanity fundraiser for the new project that's going to be coming to Estevan. So welcome Greg to his Legislative Assembly. And as well, sitting with him is Don Kindop. Don Kindop is currently a member of the Emmanuel Health Board, and he's a member of our local council that we have there in Estevan as far as health goes. But more importantly, just not so many years ago, he was my grade 6 teacher and principal. Yes, it really wasn't all that long ago. And actually, I was remiss last time I introduced him in the House. The member from Moose Jaw Waccamaw wants to ensure that it was also his grade 6 teacher and principal. So welcome them to their Legislative Assembly, Mr. Speaker. And just while I'm on my feet, I want to extend a great big hello to Andrew Kitchen, who is sitting up in the gallery. Andrew is a friend of my daughter Miranda. They both teach at Fairhaven School in Saskatoon, so I just want to, welcome him here to his assembly and thank the teachers for all the good work they do. Thank you.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister and my colleague from Saskatoon Centre in welcoming Todd Brandt to his legislature. Many, many years ago, before being an MLA, I had the privilege of sitting on the Children's Discovery Museum Board. I was the co-chair with the very amazing Erica Bird. And back in those days, we didn't even have a facility, Mr. Speaker. We were looking to open up a facility, a small facility at Market Mall in Saskatoon to try to help people understand what a children's museum is. And Todd was incredibly gracious with his time and advice in helping and supporting Erica and I to connect with folks, and he still continues to be incredibly gracious when we run into each other, Mr. Speaker. And I'm really proud to say I haven't been on that board for almost a decade now, Mr. Speaker, since my time in this House, but it's really wonderful that that board, primarily some amazing stewardship, but Erica Bird has been great, but they will be opening their doors in a permanent landmark facility in Saskatoon in the very near future. But I'd just like to say thank you to Todd for all his advice and for helping make Saskatoon the dynamic city that he is. He's really been a leader in championing Saskatoon. So I'd like to ask all members in welcoming Todd to his legislature. And while I'm on my feet, I'd like to also join with the member opposite in welcoming Andrew Kitchen to his legislature as well. Fairhaven is in my constituency, and I have had the privilege of heading over to his school and chatting with his students last year, Mr. Speaker. So just again, let's all welcome Andrew to his Legislative Assembly.
As a member for Moose Jaw North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the West Gallery there are 25 students from Vanier Collegiate that are visiting with the legislator this afternoon watching the proceedings. They are the Social Studies 30 class, along with their teacher, Mr. Dana Stropad. So I'd like to welcome them here. Vanier is a great college, collegiate in our city. In fact, on Saturday they were down playing volleyball at Fort Capel. I happened to be in Fort Capel at the time and just caught the end of their game, so I really don't know how they made out with the tournament, but I'd like all members to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join the member from Moose Jaw North in welcoming the students from Vanier Collegiate. I'm a proud Vanier Viking, class of 1993, and very, very proud of that school. I'm sure Social Studies 30 is where I got all of my political opinions and beliefs, so thankful for that, as I'm sure all members are. And I'd just like to join the member and ask everyone to welcome the students from Vanier to their legislature. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, it's a great pleasure to welcome and to introduce to you and through you Jasmine Liska, seated in your gallery. Jasmine is my constituency assistant in Saskatoon-Meewasin. She is a pretty wonderful constituency assistant to work with, very patient, as the members will clearly point out. She has a master's in English, and is a wonderful editor, so please keep an eye on your syntax today. She's also an expert kayaker, runner, and ultimate player. And her partner Mark is a jeweler who does amazing work in metal and he'll be presenting that jewelry at the Wintergreen Festival of the Saskatchewan Craft Council, or he is presenting that this week, so very, very nice stuff. And just a great chance to have Jasmine in the Assembly with us today. She's a very effective advocate for the people who come forward, works so hard to represent their needs. She's great to work with, and as I'm sure everyone here can understand, it's so important to have someone who you trust and in whom you have confidence in that constituency office. So would all members please join me in welcoming Jasmine to her legacy.
Recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to also join with the two members in welcoming the students from Musha and also the principal, who's from my constituency of Chamberlain. He's a good friend, Dana, of myself, and also the member from Lumsden Morris. Dana, I've known Dana for a number of years as a member from Lumsden Morris, and he has helped us immensely in our campaigns over the years and involved in our executive, but also, more importantly, he is a very good volunteer for the town of Chamberlain and that area. A very good hard worker and a very great principal. Again, I want to welcome him and his students here at coming here to the legislature. Thank you. Here.
Welcome, everyone. Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned Saskatchewan people today as it relates to the devastation or the attack on our classrooms by the SAS Party. Mr. Speaker, they cite the damaging cuts by the SAS Party, $54 million in cuts in just the 2017-18 budget, of course inadequately funding education this year, classrooms that were already strained, classrooms that are facing a significant complexity of learners within them, Mr. Speaker, and teachers that really are left without the supports and students left without the supports that they deserve, and that all too often the SAS Party government simply disrespects and dismisses the concerns raised by teachers and school boards, parents and students all across our province. And the prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the government to fully restore the senseless cuts to our kids' classrooms and to stop making families, teachers, and everyone who works to support our education system pay the price for the SAS Party's mismanagement. These petitions today are signed by concerned residents from Estevan and Moose Jaw. I so submit.
So let's recognize the member for Cut Knife Turtleford. There we go.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the citizens of Spiritwood, Mayfair, Leoville. I do so present.
Here, here. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of this province want to bring to your attention the following, that the Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside the province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. And we know that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. And you know, Mr. Speaker, over the past 10 years, the SAS Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Wow. You know, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. And we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia, but unfortunately Ontario's moved the other direction, has moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, I do so present. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in my place today to present a petition that calls for the establishment of a dialysis unit for northwestern communities. The northwestern Saskatchewan residents living so far from the home units in Saskatoon or the satellite units in North Battleford or Prince Albert face a significant financial burden from the cost of travel and accommodation and from the cost to accommodate their condition that would sometimes necessitate a move to Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, that the access to health services is one of the 12 determinants of health outcomes, and a satellite dialysis unit in the area would help create optimal health outcomes while minimizing healthcare costs and the financial burden to patients. So I'll read the prayer, Mr. Speaker, that we, the following, ask the provincial government to provide the public funding to set up a satellite unit in northwestern Saskatchewan to provide hemodialysis treatment that is in closer proximity to patients' homes. This would greatly lessen the burden of out-of-pocket costs for the people from this area who are undergoing kidney dialysis. This would allow northwestern people with kidney failure to live where they want to live and not have to be forced to move in order to stay alive. Mr. Speaker, the people that have signed the many pages of this petition are from all throughout Saskatchewan, and on this particular page, the people that have signed are primarily from the Losh, and I so present.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition in support of in-house security services at Saskatchewan healthcare facilities. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that the Government of Saskatchewan's security services review in the Saskatchewan Health Authority appears to be driven by a desire to contract out and cut costs rather than improve safety in healthcare, and that safe, quality healthcare means having an adequately staffed, properly trained, and equipped in-house security team, not cutting jobs and contracting out to the lowest private bidder. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the government to commit to maintaining quality, publicly funded, publicly delivered, and publicly administered security services. This particular petition is signed by individuals from Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, I do so present.
I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House today to present a petition to restore public control over Wascana Park. Mr. Speaker, the individuals who have signed this petition wish to bring to our attention the following. Wascana Park is a treasured urban park and conservation area that had been responsibly managed through an equal partnership between the City of Regina, the provincial government, and the University of Regina for more than 50 years. The government unilaterally gave itself majority control of the board of the Provincial Capital Commission through the changes brought on by Bill 50, the Provincial Capital Commission Act in 2017. And the City of Regina and the University of Regina have both expressed an openness and a willingness to return to a governance model based on equality. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the government to restore the governance structure of the Wascana Centre Authority and end the commercialization of Wascana Park. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing this petition today come from Moose Jaw and Regina. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Number one. Good. Mr. Speaker, November 17 to 25 is Celebrate Saskatchewan Multicultural Week. By marking this week, the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan aims to create welcoming and inclusive communities. On Saturday at Government House, Barb Didi received the Betty Sushwitz 2018 Award for a person who has made significant contributions to our multicultural community. Barb was thanked for her work at Spring Free from Racism and the Saskatchewan Association on Human Rights. Barb has spent her life advocating for the rights of workers, women, and for multiculturalism. Barb told CBC about her unique childhood experiences that helped her become aware of various cultures and taught her to celebrate our cultural diversity as a strength. Now, Albert Radan of Regina was recognized with the Youth Leadership Award. The 17-year-old student at Sheldon-Williams Collegiate came to Canada nearly 3 years ago, leaving a refugee camp in Jordan to make her way to Regina. She plans to build on the power of multiculturalism by following in the footsteps of inspiration her teacher Kyla McIntyre. We were treated to now reciting her poem about her personal experiences as a refugee. Well done. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in congratulating Barb and now on their recognition. We are so fortunate to have citizens like these and all the nominees who are passionate about celebrating our diversity every day here in Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Lumsden Morse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today marks the beginning of Canadian Western Agribition. It is Western Canada's premier agricultural marketplace, trade show and rodeo held annually in this city. It will attract an estimated $73.6 million over the week, as well as untold millions in future sales, and attract 1,250 international delegates from 86 countries. Since 1971, Agribition has worked to advocate for Saskatchewan's agricultural industry. New events this year include a mental health workshop, a panel on food, fuel, and free trade, an agripreneurship workshop, Texas Longhorns, alpacas, rank mini ponies, Elite 3 Canadian cow dog futurity, and fleece and furious sheep herding demonstration. Mr. Speaker, our government is proud to continue to support this event. Today we announced continued funding for Agribition's market development activities along with the federal government under the Canadian Agricultural Partnerships Product to Market program. This commitment of up to $500,000 over 5 years will allow Canadian Western Agribition to continue expanding its international marketing activities. I'd like to thank the Canadian Western Agribition team for the great work they do, putting on such an impressive show year after year, and encourage everyone to take time to check out this world-class event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, I always say that the nicest people in Saskatchewan are in Prince Albert, and one only has to look to St. Mary's High School in my constituency to find such people. On October 21st, Ecause St. Mary held a very special graduation ceremony with only one graduate honoured. That graduate is Jake Deal. Jake was unable to attend the graduation with classmates a few months earlier because he was suffering from serious injuries, including a head injury, which he had incurred in a longboarding accident just prior to their graduation date. The school decided that when Jake recovered, they would hold a special ceremony for him, ensuring that it would be just like their usual graduation ceremonies, including a reading of scripture, a speech by the school principal, Mark Fineff, and the presentation of the diploma. Mr. Speaker, the school chapel was filled with over 70 people on hand to help Jake celebrate his success. Jake was greeted with a standing ovation when he entered the chapel. The thoughtfulness shown by the school, the principal, staff, and Jake's friends shows exactly what makes Prince Albert so special. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join with me in congratulating Jake Deal on his graduation, and also to commend Ecause St. Mary and Principal Mark Fineff for their kindness in organizing this very special event. Thank you.
Recognize a member for Last Mountain Touchwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Saturday evening I had the distinct pleasure of attending the 20th anniversary celebration of SSTI here in the Assembly, hosted by yourself, Mr. Speaker. One of those in attendance was former Speaker Toth, who I see has joined us in the Speaker's Gallery. Former Speaker Glenn Hagel told those of us in attendance of how SSTI was first came to be as it started during his term as Speaker. Back in 1994, then MLA Hagel attended the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Westminster Seminar in London, England. Many of the Commonwealth delegates expressed concern over growing public cynicism of elected members and low voter turnout. All agreed that something needed to be done, but the question was who was going to do something about it. It is widely accepted that key to our democracy is knowledge and participation. The enemy of democracy is ignorance and apathy. A healthy democracy needs informed, active voters. Fast forward to 1999, Mr. Speaker, when now Speaker Hagel was able to put together a partnership of social science teachers, the then Department of Education, and this legislature led by the Speaker's office. And hence, the first Canadian provincial Social Science Teachers Institute became a reality right here in Saskatchewan. Good government needs good people, Mr. Speaker, to serve as members of our legislature, and the goal of SSTI is to inspire teachers so that they can inspire their students, which will in turn keep our democracy strong. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past October, I had the privilege to once again attend the Lakeland Citizen of the Year banquet held in Christopher Lake. This year's honoree is Marcia Bergman, a well-known longtime volunteer and friendly neighbour to many in the Christopher and Emma Lake region. I was honoured to be able to personally congratulate Mrs. Bergman on all of her achievements. Mr. Speaker, Marcia is a retired school teacher who still enjoys substituting in the classrooms at John Diefenbaker, Spruce Home, and Christopher Lake schools. Marcia has served the Emma and Christopher Lakes Association as treasurer for many years. She has been in charge of the Red Cross swimming program. She volunteers at the Christopher Lake Public Library, as well as the Lakeland Recreation Board. Mr. Speaker, she has contributed hundreds of volunteer hours to her community, and judging by the large crowd in attendance at the banquet, she has garnered many friends. It is individuals like Marcia Bergman who keep small-town communities alive and thriving. I wish to say thank you to the many volunteers who organized the 2018 Lakeland Citizen of the Year banquet in honor of Marcia Bergman, and to congratulate Marcia on being a leader in her community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Lloyd-Minster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize this past Saturday, November 17th, as International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. This is a day when individuals and communities that have felt the effects of suicide gather to find comfort in one another and gain understanding by sharing stories of healing and hope. Mr. Speaker, suicide is a serious and complex issue that can have many contributing factors. Our hearts go out to anyone who has lost a loved one, a member of their community, or has in any way been affected by it. This is an issue that we take very seriously, Mr. Speaker. We want anyone in a time of crisis to know that supports are available to them. Mr. Speaker, anyone experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts can call Healthline 811 at any time of day or night. Children and youth can also access counseling through Kids Help Phone, by phone or online. Mr. Speaker, Healthline and Kids Help Phone provide an important role as a frontline response in the moment when people really need it. They also help connect people with other mental health services in their communities. Mr. Speaker, suicide is an issue that affects our friends, families, and our communities. That is why it is important for us to continue to support one another. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon, Willow Grove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, they say playing football in the snow in November in Saskatchewan is a badge of honor, and that was certainly the case this year. Our beloved Riders held their first home playoff game at our beautiful Mosaic Stadium. Not the result we wanted, but we are ready for next year. In exciting high school action, congratulations to the member from Regina Gardner Park, as his Regina Miller Marauders won the provincial championship over Saskatoon Centennial Collegiate. Way to go, Coach. Saskatoon Bishop Montney beat Regina Sheldon Williams. Congratulations to Lumsden over Humboldt and Delisle over Indian Head in 9-man action. In 6-man play, it was Clavette over Waka and Hafford Blaine Lake over the Hanley Sabres. To the member from Arm River, pay up your bet. In Lloydminster, the Comprehensive Barons and the Holy Rosary Raiders are doing very well in the Alberta provincial competitions. It was a great year for the University of Saskatchewan Huskies and Coach Scott Flory as the Huskies won the U Sport Canada West title before bowing out to London, Ontario and the Western Ontario Mustangs in the Mitchell Bowl. And history was made this year, Mr. Speaker, as the storied Saskatoon Hilltops won their 5th Canadian Junior Football Championship in a row over the Langley Rams this past Saturday at SMF Field in Saskatoon. Congratulations to all players, coaches, parents and fans. You are an example of healthy lifestyles and excellence in Saskatchewan. Your province is proud of you. I ask all members to help me congratulate these outstanding teams.
Question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by recognizing and thanking the Premier for his statement earlier today. When a mistake is made and we own up to it and apologize, that's really the kind of accountability that people want to see here in Saskatchewan. Now, in that same vein of accountability, and on the same day as that particular error, the Premier was asked in this House as well as in the Rotunda whether he thought that non-criminality was a high enough bar to judge the ethics and accountability of a government. He didn't give a clear answer then, so let's try again. When real concerns arise surrounding the ethical nature of decisions of this government, does the Premier expect Saskatchewan people to be satisfied that all is well just because no one has been criminally charged?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was asked with reference to a case that came up last week, Mr. Speaker, with respect to e-health. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, and the people of the province can rest assured that there was a policy in place, a conflict of interest policy in place, Mr. Speaker. That policy was adhered to by our professional public service, Mr. Speaker, and there were very serious consequences in the case of this instance, Mr. Speaker. The employees lost their jobs, and we shouldn't forget that. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to know if vendor-sponsored travel was a common practice across government, Mr. Speaker, and it turns out that it's not. Based on the information that has been provided to me, and I have asked my Deputy Minister to check with government ministries and agencies whether there were instances where employees have accepted vendor-sponsored travel, and to date, Mr. Speaker, we have not found any additional instances. So the NDP's allegation, Mr. Speaker, that there's some sort of culture within the public service in this case is just not the case, Mr. Speaker. The culture is at the province. This province of Saskatchewan is served by professional and honourable public servants, Mr. Speaker, who take their duties very seriously and who take conflict of interest policies in this province, Mr. Speaker, very, very seriously.
Hear, hear. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a government that said it was to be the most transparent government in Saskatchewan history. Well, it's pretty see-through why the Premier wouldn't want to answer directly that question of whether non-criminality was a sufficient bar for ethics within government decisions, Mr. Speaker. See-through because he doesn't want to have a judicial inquiry into the GTH. He doesn't want to have to admit that non-criminal charges is enough there. He doesn't want to admit that there may be more of a problem when it comes to e-health and vendor-sponsored junkets within his government, Mr. Speaker. So I want to see if we can get some clear answers on e-health. It's clear from press reports that this is not an isolated incident or one that just happened in recent months. It's something that's been happening over years within e-health. So I want to know, when did the Premier discover that this was going on, and when he discovered that, what did he do about it?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in the case of e-health and the individuals that were in violation of the public policy, the public sector policy, Mr. Speaker, the professional public service that we had took action, Mr. Speaker. They enacted on that policy and very serious consequences came about. Mr. Speaker, these individuals lost their jobs. Mr. Speaker, our public servants follow these policies. The policies that prohibit and accepting travel from a vendor who has a contractual relationship with the government. But so far, Mr. Speaker, and we've been looking into the Crown agencies and ministries, Mr. Speaker, and we actually haven't found any additional cases where vendor travel has occurred. That's why I'm comfortable with the current policy that effectively prohibits vendor-sponsored travel by public servants, Mr. Speaker, by our professional public service. I've asked my Deputy Minister to reinforce that policy with all government employees, Mr. Speaker. So unlike the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, members on this side are very confident that our professional public servants will continue to follow and enforce the policy appropriately. Hear, hear.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have great confidence in our public servants as well. But when it comes to errors that are made within the public service, when there are problems, the responsibility lies with the minister, it lies with the Premier. And we want to hear, when did the Premier find out that this was going on? It's been going on for years. When did the Premier find out, and what did he do about it? We didn't hear an answer on that. But I'm going to, hopefully he'll in his next response, respond to that. But I want to quote something from the Star Phoenix. In an editorial this weekend, they said that the NDP opposition's suggestion that the minister's staff release the list of all vendor-sponsored travel across all government ministries and crowns is entirely reasonable. Does the Premier agree that that's reasonable? And will he commit, once this review is finished, to tabling the list of all the vendor-sponsored travel in crowns, agencies and ministries in the last 10 years?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, does the NDP leader and the opposition, Mr. Speaker, continue to allege that there's some sort of widespread traditional practice in the public service of this type of behavior? And it's simply just not the case, Mr. Speaker. We have a professional public service that members of this side of the House support, Mr. Speaker, who follow and enforce these policies. In this particular case of e-health, Mr. Speaker, this matter, this policy and the procedures that occurred here have been referred to the provincial auditor, Mr. Speaker, the independent office that will ensure that the policies and the procedures are audited, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the people of the province, to give the people of this province the assurance that we have a strong policy in place, Mr. Speaker, and that the professional public service is adhering to the policy as they did in these rare instances, like in e-health, where there was a violation, Mr. Speaker. And again, I reiterate, there was very serious consequences in this incident, as there was up to and including people actually lost their jobs, Mr. Speaker. So the NDP leader, Mr. Speaker, and the NDP may not have any faith in our public servants, but I rest assured that the members on this side most certainly do have all of the confidence in the professional public service in adhering to this policy, Mr. Speaker, and enforcing the policy when necessary.
Hear, hear. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June, CBC News reported that in April, after the concerns regarding the vendor-sponsored junkets had come to light and those 3 employees had been fired, then interim CEO Kevin Wilson requested a review of existing e-health contracts. He indicated that the board had suggested an external investigation would be preferable, and that the focus of this investigation would be, and I quote, following the money. eHealth's interim CEO saw a very troubling pattern regarding the distribution of contracts and requested an external investigation to get to the bottom of it. Has the requested review of existing contracts taken place, and will it be made public?
Hear, hear. I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my understanding is the outside legal firm that conducted the review with the assistance of senior management at eHealth, I believe that the investigation is complete. Mr. Speaker, again, I would reiterate what the Premier said. This was a very serious situation. It was treated as such. Those employees were terminated from their positions, Mr. Speaker. In the meantime, we're very concerned about what had happened. All records are being turned over to the provincial auditor. She's been informed all along. We are asking her office to do a complete and thorough review as they see appropriate, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to anything coming back from her, and if it turns up something else, we'll act accordingly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to those contracts that have been signed with the companies that have been sponsoring these trips, these luxury trips, my question is, what steps have been taken to ensure that those contracts went through the full process of ensuring that they were in the best value for Saskatchewan taxpayers and not influenced by the gifts that were given to those employees?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that was part of the review done by external counsel when they were looking into the matter of the employees that were terminated. My understanding is they reviewed the appropriate contracts. I've been told that the board was informed that there was value for money and that wasn't an issue. Again, as I said though, Mr. Speaker, we're very concerned about what had happened. Everything's been turned over to the provincial auditor. She'll have the opportunity to review anything as she sees appropriate, and we look forward to any comments from her. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It says a lot when a simple question is put forward and avoided. And so I will repeat once again, when did the Premier become aware of these activities, of these luxury travel sponsored by vendors? When did he become aware?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure of the exact date that I was informed of it. Senior officials informed me once the investigation by the outside law firm had begun. Mr. Speaker, we did what's appropriate for politicians. We let senior management handle HR issues, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I was briefed accordingly as senior officials thought was appropriate. I was made aware of what the findings of the outside law firms revealed, Mr. Speaker, and I support that the senior officials made the appropriate decisions. Employees were terminated. They lost their job, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, all records, all information has been turned over to the provincial auditor, independent officer of this legislature, Mr. Speaker. We look forward to her doing her good work as she sees appropriate, Mr. Speaker, and if anything comes out of that, again, Mr. Speaker, we'll act accordingly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the question was to the Premier about when he discovered this. It's also very concerning to know when the Minister discovered this information, Mr. Speaker. This has been going on for years, been going on in an agency that had members of the Minister of Health staff on the board. Why was he not made aware sooner? And at what point did he become aware that this has been going on for several years, Mr. Speaker? So my question is, the next time the Public Accounts Committee convenes to review this matter, will the Premier and the Minister commit to bring all the people involved forward as witnesses to shine a bright light and get to the bottom of exactly what happened?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Leader of the Opposition loves a conspiracy, but Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times today in this House, officials inform me at some point, I don't remember the exact day, although the member opposite thinks somehow this is a court of law and I should know the exact date and time. I informed the Premier of the situation. But, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't dealing with it hands-on. It's an HR matter. We let our senior officials deal with that. Politicians don't hire and fire in those sorts of positions, Mr. Speaker. As far as, you know, the constant insinuation that there's something else going on, Mr. Speaker, if the member's aware of something, he should bring it to our attention so we can deal with it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll quote once again the editorial from the Star Phoenix on the weekend, which said that it also seems obvious that the government needs to release the investigation completed. Oh, pardon me.
Order, please. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I'll quote the editorial from the Star Phoenix on the weekend, which said that it also seems obvious that the government needs to release the investigation completed by an external law firm into the e-health employee travel, which resulted in the firings. When will we see that report, Mr. Speaker?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to be as transparent as possible, but Mr. Speaker, in this case, I've had a number of conversations with senior officials who advise me that HR matters are typically not made public for a variety of reasons, Mr. Speaker. We're going to respect that. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, the Premier indicated that we've looked across executive government for any instances of this. I've asked the former Saskatoon Health Region, now the Saskatchewan Health Authority, Mr. Speaker, to review any possibility of any sorts of cases happening in that area. Mr. Speaker, again, we're extremely concerned about this. We're going to continue to look into it. Mr. Speaker, if the member is aware of something, I wish he'd bring it to our attention and we'll deal with it accordingly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're aware that there's a serious issue here and there's a report been done into it. We're aware that the Minister doesn't want to share that report. We're aware that there's an investigation going on to how much vendor-sponsored travel has gone on. We're aware that the Premier hasn't committed to sharing that with us. So my question for the Premier is, will you continue in the spirit of accountability in which you started the day? Will you commit to sharing the report? Will the Premier commit to sharing that report, making it public as soon as possible? And will he commit to sharing and tabling the list of all vendor-sponsored travel throughout his government?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I've already answered the question on the report. Senior officials advise it's an HR matter and shouldn't be made public. And Mr. Speaker, as far as the list, the Premier already answered that. To date, there is no list. It's been looked into. No incidences have come forward so far, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Sure. Saskatchewan people are rightfully proud of our potash sector. It's been built by and for generations of Saskatchewan people. When it was first announced that Potash Corp and Agrium would be merging together, we raised concerns that this could put Saskatoon's head office, Saskatchewan clout, and good jobs at risk. And we called for due diligence and certainty. At that time, I called on Brad Wall to ensure that we would have ironclad protections in place to protect jobs and to ensure that the head office in Saskatoon was more than simply a head office on paper, that it would be filled with the entire executive team and the management of that company if this merger were to proceed. And now, after 2 years of inaction by that government, Nutrien is on track to have only one executive left in that head office. Just one executive. How did the Premier let this happen? What's the Premier going to do to fix this?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that we share the concerns regarding the head office presence of executives with Nutrien in the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, we're aware of the head office requirements under the Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan Reorganization Act, Mr. Speaker. We're also aware that the board, the executive, Mr. Speaker, and the shareholders would have been aware of the continuance of this requirement, Mr. Speaker, under the merger of PCS and Agrium forming the new company of Nutrien, Mr. Speaker. That's why the Premier's office, myself, Mr. Speaker, have reached out to the board chair of Nutrien to meet with him in the near future with respect to giving us an update, giving the province an update, Mr. Speaker, with respect to their current operations and their intended operations into the future, Mr. Speaker. And we expect that the board of Nutrien will abide, Mr. Speaker, by the legislation here in the province of Saskatchewan.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, it just seems weak in response to the challenge that we're facing. Many, many promises have been offered about that important head office, including when all of us, together with Saskatchewan people, stood up to block the takeover of Potash Corp back in 2010. Certainly promises have been made, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, but whether they're honored is something else, and whether we have a government that's principled and strong enough to stand up for the interests of Saskatchewan people is what's at question here, Mr. Speaker. They were supposed to protect Saskatchewan jobs and ensure Saskatchewan's global clout and expertise in this proud and critical industry here in Saskatchewan. You know, we heard reference of these actions and these commitments from the Sask Party government in the 2017 throne speech, and we heard from Brad Wall in 2016 that we'd all be comfortable that the headquarters would be based in Saskatoon. Yep. They've made a lot of noise about protecting the head office, Mr. Speaker, but failed to get the job done like on so many other fronts. How can this Premier justify this government's failure to act and ensure we have a vibrant head office of this very important company in this very important industry here in Saskatchewan? Why won't he stand up for Saskatchewan?
I recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has made clear he's going to be meeting with the chairman of the board of Nutrien. We do have concerns with regard to the head office presence. That being said, Nutrien has increased their head office their employment presence from 260 to 335 jobs at the Saskatoon office. The Nutrien Ag Solutions has relocated its head office from High River, Alberta to Regina. But, Mr. Speaker, I have to address something in the preamble about standing up for the potash industry in this province. Mr. Speaker, the record on this side of the House is clear and unequivocal. We were the ones that stood up for Potash Corporation, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you, as one of the co-lead ministers on that file, that the members opposite contributed nothing to that defense of Potash Corp, Mr. Speaker. They sought to capitalize politically to a degree. They provided nothing. What is their record on potash, Mr. Speaker? Chasing out companies, nationalizing the industry, Mr. Speaker, declining production. That's their record on potash. On this side of the House, we're seeing increasing production, increasing jobs, and increasing prosperity, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, that's a weak answer to a very serious issue for the people of Saskatchewan. The question was to the Premier, and we don't need any more pinky swears from the company. We need action for Saskatchewan people. Will the Premier stand up and insist that we have a full head office in Saskatoon for this critical industry to our province?
Recognize the Minister of Export and Trade Development.
Mr. Speaker, with regard to the members opposite, we have seen an incredibly weak record, Mr. Speaker. That's right. Those members nationalized the potash industry.
That's right.
Those members chased out private sector companies, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we have defended the industry, Mr. Speaker. We have seen massive expansion in the potash sector. We have seen massive increases in exports from this province under potash. What is their policy going forward, Mr. Speaker? Their policy, massive royalty hikes. I wouldn't doubt if we see further nationalization coming forward from them as a policy platform, Mr. Speaker. A recipe for destruction of our potash sector. That's what those members provide, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we stand up strongly for this province.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that we have one of the most dysfunctional and costly ambulance systems in the country. Patients in rural and remote areas are not only waiting too long for ambulances, once they do arrive, they are penalized for living outside major cities by this government's per-kilometre fees. According to the Ministry of Health, the average cost per call was nearly $1,100 to the patient. We have been raising concerns about these cost burdens for years, and this government has done nothing. We know the EMS redesign consultation process wrapped up in July of last year. When will we see the final recommendations? When can Saskatchewan people stop being punished for being sick? Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Rural and Remote Health continues to consult with the various ambulance groups, Mr. Speaker, as we move forward under one Saskatchewan Health Authority that we expect will continue to enhance uniformity of service across the province, including in ambulance care, Mr. Speaker. To the members' questions about the cost, though, I think it's important to understand that patient fees account for about 5% of the total cost of the ambulance services provided, Mr. Speaker. That's for air ambulance, for ground ambulance. I believe it's slightly more, but Mr. Speaker, it's still the vast majority of ambulance fees are already subsidized by the government, Mr. Speaker. We recognize that in some instances that it can be an excessive burden on the patient. So in those cases, there's provisions made for low-income people. But Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to move forward and provide good ambulance coverage for the province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, this system is not good enough. Manitoba's ambulance system used to be as costly and burdensome as ours, and they took action and they reduced their ambulance fees by 35% in 2 years. This government knows they are failing Saskatchewan patients. The minister's own briefing note reads, quote, "Ground EMS in Saskatchewan has fallen significantly behind other jurisdictions in Canada when it comes to putting patients first and providing responsive, affordable, and efficient ground ambulance services," end quote. We are the only jurisdiction in Canada that charges patients for transfer from one health facility to another. According to ministry documents, a person needing to transfer from the Nipawin Hospital to Saskatoon for an MRI would have to pay more than $1,500. Wow. Does this make any sense, Mr. Speaker? Will the minister commit that charging patients to transfer between hospitals will not be part of our transformed ambulance system?
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize how important ambulance service is to this province. Mr. Speaker, since we were given the privilege of forming government, Mr. Speaker, we've doubled the amount of spent on ambulance service from $44 million to $87 million, Mr. Speaker. Not only that, under the watch of this government, Mr. Speaker, we've brought in STARS, which has been hugely successful, Mr. Speaker. It's done an incredible service. It's saved many lives all across rural and remote areas of this province, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to attempt to enhance that. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the Minister of Rural and Remote Health has been doing a great deal of consultation with ambulance services. We're going to continue to work on that and continue to provide good ambulance services and more uniformity across the piece, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm sorry, then. Why is the member on her feet?
Ask leave for an introduction, please.
Minister has asked for leave for an introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, I would like to introduce a member in your gallery. The Mayor of Estevan, Roy Ludwig, is with us today. Roy has worked tirelessly for the City of Estevan for the past several years, not only as Mayor but as Council. I believe he's broaching 25 years working for our community, and we thank him for his service. And I look forward to meetings with him later today. So if you would welcome him to his assembly, that would be great. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Speaker, to you and through you, it's an honour to join with the member opposite to welcome Mayor Ludwig to his assembly. This is somebody who has served our entire province for a long period of time. He has had a long career with Sask Power, Mr. Speaker, and certainly an important service as well to the people of Estevan on council and now as mayor. So I ask all members to welcome Roy Ludwig to his assembly. And while on my feet, Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to introduce somebody that was referenced earlier here, Mr. Speaker. Seated in your gallery is Don Toth, the former and long-serving member for Mooseman, former Speaker of the Assembly, a friend to many in this Assembly, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour and pleasure to welcome Don Toth to his Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Mooseman.
Speaker, I'd also like to welcome today, along with leave, ask leave for introduction. Sorry.
Members asked for leave for an extended introduction, but I think while you're on your feet, apparently will suffice.
My pleasure to welcome today also Mr. Don Toth to this Legislative Assembly. He's a long-term member of Mooseman constituency, and he was perhaps the best constituency man ever, and I'm reminded of that very often in my constituency. But he's someone who's never wavered on his morals or ethics. He's someone I think that everyone in this assembly can take a good lesson from. One of the most ethical men I've ever met, and with that I'd like to ask all members to welcome him to his Legislative Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day, second readings. Item number 1, the Honourable Ms. Tell to move first reading of Bill number 149, the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018.
Recognize the Minister of Corrections and Policing.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018. This bill represents our government's ongoing commitment to enhance rural policing in the province and address issues surrounding rural crime. In particular, this bill will update the Police Act 1990 to allow rural municipalities and other municipalities with populations below 500 to join regional police services. Although the Act currently allows for the establishment of regional police services, rural municipalities are not permitted to take part in regional policing arrangements, except in limited circumstances. Adding rural municipalities to regional policing provisions will provide those communities with an additional policing option that focuses specifically on rural citizens. Mr. Speaker, this bill aligns with the recommendation in the Caucus Committee on Crime Report to pursue regional policing in Saskatchewan and is a part of a comprehensive strategy to enhance policing in rural Saskatchewan. Other initiatives that form part of this strategy include the Rural Crime Watch program, RCMP crime reduction teams, Community Safety Officer program, the Protection and Response team, and a review of the First Nations policing model. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to the safety and security of residents of rural Saskatchewan and recognizes the importance of rural policing in this province. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018. Thank you.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 149 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased on behalf of the official opposition to enter the debate as the Minister introduced her bill, Bill number 149, the Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018. Now, Mr. Speaker, this bill is really, really important for the future and for the security of Saskatchewan people overall, and we're paying a lot of attention as the official opposition as to how we roll out this particular plan to really have the municipalities, especially the RMs, and other smaller community or other governments like the towns and villages and sometimes the resort communities on how they could partner up to create a more inclusive policing approach as they deal with issues of, as was alluded to, rural crime. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is a really important bill because from our perspective as the opposition, we understand that there is a rural crime problem as we've been subjected to many newspaper articles, many radio talk shows, and certainly television and the internet and people's comments on Facebook. We know that there is an incredible challenge as it pertains to rural crime out there. We understand that people are not feeling safe in some of the rural parts of the province. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that it's happening in our cities. I would suggest it's happening in our northern communities. I would suggest it's happening in our First Nations communities. And one of the key determinants as we look at it as to why the crime is appearing to be flourishing, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that there's many aspects of approach that we as a government should use, and that's one of the points that I want to raise as the member of the opposition, that we have to have a multifaceted approach towards dealing with crime, not just in rural Saskatchewan, but throughout our entire province. Obviously, rural Saskatchewan have been highlighted in the news recently, and certainly from our perspective, we don't want to see families threatened. We don't want to see property stolen. We don't want to see people willingly freely going into people's private yards and homes, you know, to do illegal activity. So it's really important, Mr. Speaker, is that we do something significant for the future of this province. And when we talk about the Bill 149, it really allows rural municipalities and other municipalities with populations under 500 to join regional police services. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've always maintained that the police cannot do this job on their own. They have steadfastly brought forward this information time and time again that they need public cooperation, they need education, they need services to strengthen families, and many of the police officers will also tell you that they need comprehensive drug and alcohol treatment services so that many families that are caught up in this particular activity have a way out, which really lessens the need to turn to criminal activity, Mr. Speaker. Now, there are many people out there in Saskatchewan land that may think that part of the process is just to simply ram through legislation, put all these people in jail and lock up the key or lock up the criminal and throw away the key. Now, Mr. Speaker, in many instances, there are cases that warrant having people imprisoned for life. There's no question about that. We understand that some of the serious criminal activity of some people in Saskatchewan do warrant long-term jail sentences. But on the issue of how we deal with this problem as a society, we must look at a multifaceted approach on how we begin to turn the tide against crime, Mr. Speaker. And yes, part of the matrix for ensuring that we reduce crime in the province of Saskatchewan is to also have strong laws. Laws that protect the average citizen, laws that protect families and children and grandparents, Mr. Speaker. We need those strong laws. But we also need approaches within the community that would reduce crime, Mr. Speaker, would raise awareness of some of the challenges as we try and stop many of our young kids from getting involved with illegal drugs. These are some of the activities that we speak about on this side of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it is important to have strong laws, but there are many other aspects to how we can reduce crime. And some of the aspects that we speak about, Mr. Speaker, are things like addressing poverty, addressing drug addiction, Mr. Speaker, and just addressing the inequity within society in general to make sure that people realize that there is opportunity, there is hope for many people, and we just have to work with these families and these communities as best we can. Now, back home in Ottawa-Lacrosse, we're like many other northern communities, Mr. Speaker. We do have our challenges when it comes to illegal drugs. We do have issues when it pertains to violence. Every community, there's not any community in the province of Saskatchewan that is not subjected to this issue. And the crisis that some of the northern communities are facing, as I've indicated time and time again, I want to illustrate my point that there is an opportunity to address recovery of many people that may be addicted to illegal drugs, Mr. Speaker. And we can certainly ascertain that a big problem of the crime in our communities, and rural crime is under the same particular challenge, is that there is a drug trade that threatens all of our community, Mr. Speaker. And the illegal drug trade, Mr. Speaker, creates a lot of problems and issues for many, many families. And in northern Saskatchewan, when we talk about an approach on how we could reduce crime in our communities, of course, strong laws are important, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we want to make sure that the resources are there, because after all, the word force is in the phrase police and law enforcement, Mr. Speaker. So it's a vital, critical part of how you approach policing in the community. So as we have strong laws, as we have the necessary human resources to really enforce those laws, Mr. Speaker, we also have to incorporate what many police organizations across the country are now adopting. I think they're adopting a process where they want to engage the community more, because the more you try and put in the tough laws, which are necessary, with no reciprocal treatment services for the illegal drug use that are plaguing many of our communities, no reaching out to families, no interception of people that might be engaged in this activity later on in life, no education, no awareness. All these aspects, Mr. Speaker, are really important to be considered as an overall strategy as we look at ways and means in which we reduce crime. So it's really important to note, Mr. Speaker, that as you look at making better, more responsive laws, making sure that we have enough police officers, and we understand, Mr. Speaker, that there's a critical shortage of police officers in rural Saskatchewan and northern Saskatchewan and within our cities as well. So that's one problem in itself. So we can have good, strong laws, Mr. Speaker, but if we don't have the human resources to attach to these strong laws, then we're starting behind the 8 ball, so to speak. And the third argument I would make, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to have other issues attached to reduce crime. I think that reducing crime in our community is multifaceted. That is not just putting in strong laws. You've got to have enough police officers, and you have to have the services, Mr. Speaker, to be able to attract families away from some of the threats that we have to our society, our civil society, and that is the illegal use of drugs. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to add at the outset that I don't want to be a hypocrite here, because many times in this assembly I've admitted that I still enjoy my beer now and then, maybe too many, Mr. Speaker. However, the important point is that as you embark on this particular exercise of trying to reclaim families, we do get support, we do get advice from many of the elders on how we can reduce our own challenges as it pertains to alcohol, Mr. Speaker. So you get that support mechanisms within my own community and with my own family, and how we can deal with that. So the important thing is that you don't let it define you, and the important thing is that you don't let it control you, and the important thing is you learn. So when it comes to the illegal use of drugs within our community, which is resulting in a lot of the crime that we see throughout our province, that there has to be an avenue for families and young people that may get caught up in this trade, for them to give them hope. So we often tell people that we're not here to judge, we're here to help. We often tell people that many of us have our crosses to bear, but nonetheless we cannot allow guilt to color our optimism in dealing with some of these issues, Mr. Speaker, throughout our community. So I think it's really important to note, Mr. Speaker, is that yes, these bills are important to have. Yes, you have to have the proper resources within the police force itself. And yes, you have to have collaboration. Yes, you have to have a regional police approach, Mr. Speaker, but you've also got to deal with the issue of poverty. You've also got to deal with the issue of not having any services for drug and alcohol treatment. Yes, you have to intercept many of the young children and families that may be subjected to being attracted into the drug trade, as you know, certainly as an example. So it is a multifaceted approach that one must undertake, Mr. Speaker. And I often find that there are some people in our community that are oblivious to some of the challenges that affect many of our families that have low income. And we can't continue sticking our head in the sand. We have to know that some of those poverty factors do impact the amount of crime we have in our community and in our society. So again, I reiterate, Mr. Speaker, having bills like Bill 149 come forward, where it allows for the collaboration of smaller communities to join a regional police force, these are steps in the right direction, but they cannot be the only steps that this government takes. Otherwise, they're doing a great disservice to the current police officers that are serving, because they have a great challenge in filling as many of the positions that we have within the police force today. I understand that a young police or a new cadet that got its first posting as a police officer in any community, I think their starting salary is $56,000, Mr. Speaker, which is fairly low. You know, for somebody that has a great amount of responsibility placed upon them, it is fairly low. And you look at some of the other opportunities that many of our young men and women that may want to join the police force, they may want to look at other options as they get older and they find out that perhaps policing isn't as financially stable as it should be. So many of them don't even consider the police officer training after a while, Mr. Speaker. And this is the point I'm making. It's good to have laws in place that promote regional policing models. Nothing wrong with that. I think most people would say it's common sense. But if you don't have the human resources to attach yourself to these laws, because you continually are derelict in realizing the important work that many of our police officers are undertaking on our behalf, you will find that laws of this sort hamper the process without the proper human resources attached to it. And that's a critical point that we would raise as the opposition. The secondary point is, as the police officers that I chat with, when I ask them how we can make our communities more secure, they often talk about the community doing their part. You'll often have that conversation with many of the police that are, or the officers that are being stationed certainly in my community. They say the community has to do their part first. So the question always becomes, who moves first, the community or the police officers? How does the relationship build? Those are some of the things that we have to have serious discussion on, Mr. Speaker, because there are certain roles and responsibilities that police have, there are certain roles and responsibilities that the community has, there are certain roles and responsibilities that some of the organizations within our communities, whether it's a city, whether it's a small town, or whether it's rural Saskatchewan, or in Northern First Nations. We have to define those roles, and we have to interact with each other to be able to participate in what we all want, which is a reduction of crime and less problems and less threats to our lives. And this is the important part, Mr. Speaker, that I think is so vitally important. When we chat, when we talk about some of these bills, we have to have those robust discussions that I'm speaking about today. We have to find ways and means in which we could finance cultural events, sporting events, just activities, healthy activities within the communities that the kids could go to, Mr. Speaker, that the kids could go to. And a lot of times in some of these northern communities and some of the smaller centers, affordability to host some of these programs and have these programs on a continual basis, that in itself is a challenge, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I'm saying today that you must have robust discussions on how we could reduce crime. Yes, in rural Saskatchewan, we're hearing a lot about that in the news, but the crime also plagues our cities, our villages, our towns, and our First Nations. So we must make sure that any bill that is designed to fight crime is inclusive of all communities and not specifically to one community. Because, Mr. Speaker, we all suffer the same fate, and, Mr. Speaker, we all suffer from the same circumstances. Unless we change our thinking, unless we change our direction, we become more inclusive and much more intelligent on how we approach the whole notion around crime reduction. An ounce of prevention, Mr. Speaker, is worth a pound of cure. All of us are familiar with that particular phrase, and I say today again that reducing poverty, intercepting children at a young age, strengthening families, programs in the community, being inclusive of all people, making sure that the law works and fits for all people. And yes, Mr. Speaker, reaching out to people that have led this file, families that have struggled with children that are addicted to drugs, they would have a lot of insight on how we could intercept that earlier, how we could help the kids once they get involved in that particular trade. And that activity and that questions and those issues have got to be addressed if we're going to be effective at reducing crime. And that's the important message that I have on this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, because it affects each and every one of us. And there is not one family that I'm aware of, certainly in my communities, and I suspect in all communities, that are not affected by drugs, not affected by crime, not affected by violence, or having someone lost to violence or to drug addiction, Mr. Speaker. So it's important, it is important that we understand that we have to be in this all together, and we certainly have to have a very, very inclusive and a very robust series of initiatives to make sure that we do one single thing, and that is to reduce crime. I would close on this note, Mr. Speaker. I would close on this note. When we have conversations with police officers, we often hear the phrase, keeping the peace. And then we have the other phrase of enforcing the law. Are these one of the same, or are there two different meanings to some of that language that sometimes we pick up as MLAs? So is there a shift from where we're at now today, from enforcing the law to keeping the peace, or going back to keeping the peace as opposed to enforcing the law? It's so difficult to comprehend which activity is being undertaken. And then you incorporate, Mr. Speaker, the difference between the RCMP services and certainly the city police services, and on some occasions where you have First Nations that are involved with policing on their own policing initiatives, then you have the role of the security companies that sometimes are employed, Mr. Speaker, by the private sector. It begins to ask the question is, how do we build a better system, a good system that interacts with all types of policing in our province, but more so, Mr. Speaker, that we're all working on the same page. The police simply cannot do this job on their own. I concur and I agree. And that's why it's important to watch laws of this sort. Because all the laws, if the laws are introduced here in the Assembly as a stopgap measure and purely a political move, Mr. Speaker, then it's failing the intent of what we all have been hearing time and time again as MLAs, is that the crime must be reduced in rural Saskatchewan, and it must be reduced in our cities, it must be reduced in our towns and villages, it must be reduced in our First Nations communities, and the list goes on and on. If the people of Saskatchewan are to embrace a good gesture and a good move to address some of these issues, Mr. Speaker, they have to be assured that we have a multifaceted approach to this matter. They have to be assured of that, Mr. Speaker. And from my perspective, what I want as a northern member of a community, I want cultural programs for my grandkids. I want the DARE program in our school system to warn children about the dangers of drugs. I want to see recreational activities planned for the young people. I want to see the police patrolling our community. I want to see a very active police board. I want to see a tip line in our communities. I want to see the justice system deal with those that offend our community in a most righteous way, Mr. Speaker. These are some of the ideals that many people have, but they know it's multifaceted. They know it's multi-pronged, and it's got to be highly interactive, it's got to be flexible, and it's got to be intelligent, Mr. Speaker. And that's the point that I was raised today, and that's why we're paying so very close attention to how this bill is being introduced and what is being attached to this bill. What is being attached to this bill? So I say to the people of Saskatchewan, in particular the rural Saskatchewan people, yes, we understand the frustration as you deal with the issue of crime. There's no question about this in our minds that all people throughout our province that have been subjected to crime, whether you're First Nations, Métis, non-Indigenous, Chinese, whatever nationality you are, nobody likes being subjected to crime, and it's frustrating. And it's important that governments come along and provide a very clear answer, a very inclusive answer, Mr. Speaker, to the approach of how we maintain peace, enforce the laws, and engage the community to the extent where we are all part and all participating in the whole notion of reducing crime by making sure that we have services available, that we have programs in place, and that we have the ability to not judge others that may have had challenges in their life, but rather reach out to them to try and help them rebuild their lives and their hope in their future. I think those are really important points, Mr. Speaker. So I know my colleagues will have other issues that they want to raise as a result of this particular bill, and I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 149, the Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018.
The members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 2, the Honourable Ms. Tell to move second reading of Bill number 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018.
Recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018. Saskatchewan's civil forfeiture program takes property and profits out of the hands of criminals and uses it to fund victims programming, policing initiatives, and other programs that promote community safety. Mr. Speaker, this bill will further enhance the province's civil forfeiture program to better achieve these goals. Currently, the Act sets out a number of instances where it is presumed that property is an instrument of unlawful activity and thus subject to forfeiture. In these instances, an onus is placed on the defendant to demonstrate that the property should not be subject to forfeiture. Mr. Speaker, the proposed amendments would expand this presumption to apply to property that was previously subject to a community safety order under the Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Act, vehicle owners with a history of impaired driving suspensions, gang or terrorist activity involving prohibited and restricted firearms, and matters involving sexual offences, including sexual offences where the victim is a child. These changes align with approaches that are being explored and implemented in other jurisdictions and will help ensure that the most harmful and serious forms of criminal activity are properly covered under the civil forfeiture program. Mr. Speaker, the proposed changes will also provide that the respondent or defendant is deemed to waive their rights to property where they refuse or fail to take part in forfeiture proceedings. This change addresses situations where individuals attempt to delay or hinder the forfeiture process by avoiding proceedings. Additionally, the Director of Civil Forfeiture will be provided greater flexibility to gather information, including information from persons with a registered interest in the subject property. This will assist the Director in determining whether to commence forfeiture proceedings, particularly where lawful interest holders are entitled to protection from forfeiture under the Act. In addition to the noted changes, the proposed amendments contain further administrative updates that will enhance the operation of the forfeiture process. Saskatchewan's civil forfeiture program serves an important function in the province by taking property out of the hands of criminals and providing this support. The changes will ensure that the program can continue to achieve these goals while maintaining the appropriate safeguards to protect the lawful property interests of third parties. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018.
It's been moved by the Minister. The bill number 150 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I reiterate some of the earlier points that I made as it pertains to the notion around policing, Mr. Speaker. And legislation that comes forward, as I indicated, has to be robust in nature to ensure that we have a multifaceted approach in dealing with crime overall. You want to be able to reduce crime. That's the objective of what we're talking about here today. And part of the equation to reducing crime, as I've indicated, part of the process is justice. Part of the process is police enforcement, Mr. Speaker. But part of the process as well is to intercept families that may be subjected to some of the attraction of getting involved with, say, for example, gangs, or getting involved with illegal drugs and so on and so forth. So we have to make sure we have those initiatives that are in place. And one of the identified groups that the Saskatchewan Party government has pointed out here is the issue around gangs. And we talked about a reduction of gang activity, that you have to put money into those initiatives as well. So it's not just a matter of appearing to respond to the problem by putting in legislation such as Bill 150, Mr. Speaker. You have to have the corresponding efforts in each and every part of a crime reduction strategy. And that's what many of the people within the cities tell us, the people that have been involved with some of the activity. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you there are a lot of very smart, intelligent people out there that will give good solutions and ideas on how we could reduce crime overall. The whole important notion of reducing that crime against anybody, whether it's in a First Nations community or rural Saskatchewan or a city dweller, Mr. Speaker, is to intercept that particular activity before it happens, Mr. Speaker. That effort has to be undertaken, and that's one of the reasons why we pay very close attention to bills of this sort. The bills of this sort, as I mentioned, under the notion of police enforcement, there is the word force. I've said it before to the previous bill. So part of the process is to make sure that those that continually offend the community are punished, and that there is a factor of force as you deal with them. However, Mr. Speaker, there are many others that we could actually intercept and stop them on a road to crime, Mr. Speaker, if we do the right things. And that's our argument from the perspective of the opposition, that we must have a multifaceted approach in dealing with criminal activity overall. Those that continually to offend our communities, we must punish them, and we must allow them due process under our justice system, and we must ensure that they are held to account. Nobody is arguing that point. Nobody is soft on crime from this perspective. We are trying to tell the people of Saskatchewan that we must be smart in our approach in reducing crime. Because part of the process of reducing crime, Mr. Speaker, is really reclaiming many lives that could be impacted by that crime. And you have to have the proper resources to ensure that. Now, what I would point out, Mr. Speaker, is that often we hear from the Saskatchewan Party activities of this sort. But I point out as well is that they can put the legislation in place, but if they don't have the manpower and resources and vision attached to that legislation to achieve the results, then I tell them today that the Saskatchewan Party is really simply being political in their approach as they begin to address crime, not just in rural Saskatchewan, but throughout our entire province. And as I've indicated time and time again, we want to see the corresponding efforts in every aspect of reducing crime in our communities as robust as they need to be. We need them. We need attention given to those avenues to reduce crime. Mr. Speaker, simply introducing a bill without resources to address the police shortage that we're having in the province and to do the proactivity, if you will, to ensuring that there is ways and means in which we can reduce crime by working with many of our communities throughout the province. So again, I'm not going to belabor this particular bill. It provides another avenue of enforcement. It provides another avenue for the justice system to deal with some of the people that offend our community. But as I've indicated, Mr. Speaker, we must have corresponding efforts in certainly rehabilitative services, particularly on illegal drug use. Mr. Speaker, we have to intercept through education and awareness to our children, through schooling, or whether it's through advertising, whatever the case may be. We must do all we can to be able to afford everybody the avenue of escaping those traps, Mr. Speaker. We must ensure that everybody has opportunity for employment, because as more people work, the crime activity and the crime stats go down. That's an important aspect, Mr. Speaker. So I would tell the people of Saskatchewan that part of the process that has to be undertaken on bills such as this is that we must be complex in how we approach the solutions towards reducing crime. And if it's all about just simply introducing bill, talking about seizure of criminal property acts, Mr. Speaker, that is one step in many steps that they have to take. And we're going to pay very close attention to what other initiatives that this government attaches to these bills. Because if they don't attach major initiatives to these bills, Mr. Speaker, they're doing a great disservice to those people that are being offended by the crime. And also, Mr. Speaker, they're not offering solutions to those that we can prevent from criminal activity by being proactive on many fronts. This is a really important note, Mr. Speaker. I think we're going to be paying very close attention to how and what the accompanying support will be on these bills to ensuring that we do have a good, solid, intelligent response to some of the criminal activity within our rural parts of our province, within our First Nations communities, the towns, the cities, and the villages. We must undertake that work. The sooner, the better, Mr. Speaker. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, second readings, item number 3. The Honourable Mr. Morgan to move second reading of Bill number 151, the Personal Property Security Amendment Act 2018.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Personal Property Amendment Act, Personal Property Security Amendments Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, members of this Assembly will know that the Personal Property Security Act 1993 allows lenders and sellers to secure payment of a debt and to establish priority over other creditors by registering their security interest in the personal property of a debtor in the Personal Property Registry. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan, with the leadership of Professor Ron Cumming, has long been a leader in the development and operation of a personal property law and registries in Canada. These changes will ensure that this commercial advantage is maintained for Saskatchewan businesses and consumers. Mr. Speaker, this bill will address a series of specific issues, including security interests in electronic chattel paper, payments of debts and transfers of negotiable property by electronic funds transfer, account debtors' rights, revised conflicts of law provisions, and technical and legal language improvements to the Act to facilitate operation of the secured lending provisions in the Act. These changes reflect both increased mobility between jurisdictions and the increased use of electronic transfers and instruments. In order to promote certainty in other interprovincial transactions, personal property security legislation in Western Canada and most other Canadian jurisdictions is substantially uniform. This allows business interests and members of the public to move between jurisdictions in Canada and the United States with substantially the same legal requirements applying to their transactions. Mr. Speaker, I've directed my justice officials to continue to work with Professor Cumming and the Canadian Conference on Personal Property Security Law to promote precise uniformity to the highest degree possible. With that, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading of the Personal Property Security Amendments Act 2018.
It's been moved that Bill number 151 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Athabasca.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I'm proud to stand in my place and give our initial comments on Bill 151, the Personal Property Security Amendment Act 2018. Now, Mr. Speaker, anytime this particular minister introduces bills, we pay extra careful attention, Mr. Speaker, because we've had experience with this particular minister, and certainly from my perspective, as he introduced some legislation around voting processes, Mr. Speaker, it really created a significant problem for many of my constituents to vote properly, and that's why when he presents bills and he brings changes to the legislation forward, we do pay extra special attention to some of the bills that he's introducing, because on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, there has been some unknown circumstance, and we want to be very, very vigilant against this particular minister as he presents some of the changes towards things of significance, including the Personal Property Security Amendment Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, at the outset, this bill appears to provide new definitions and updates to the current language of the Act. It establishes the procedures to be observed for the control of electronic record of the transaction. It provides a process to continue out-of-province perfection of goods that are relocated to Saskatchewan by timely re-registration and perfection in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. These are what we've gleaned from the bill itself, and as I've indicated, there are more learned colleagues of the law in our caucus than certainly myself, and I'm certainly looking forward to their particular participation on this particular bill, because as I mentioned, it's important to pay extra careful attention by any bills presented by this current minister, because he's had a history of providing bills that certainly on many occasions, as I've indicated, that I've found that some of the intent of the bill wasn't as fair as should be. So, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we pay attention to these bills. As well, Mr. Speaker, this bill creates an equitable interest in goods where it's substantially paid for. It changes the rules governing the protection of transferees of a negotiable collateral. I'm assuming these are all assets that have been assigned. Sets out the roles of assignees, sets out the right of a secured party on default where the collateral is a license. Mr. Speaker, it certainly it has perfection rules by possession with respect to purchase money security interest and possession rules for shipped goods. These are all very legal. This is a very legal document, and there's a lot of legal language attached to it. Something that a lay person will have to take a lot of time to understand what is being proposed here, Mr. Speaker. I'm in that same boat. So I think it's important that we take the time to understand exactly what this minister has planned with this legislation. And we're on guard on a continual basis as it pertains to this minister's activities, because they have shown in the past that sometimes, no matter how innocuous the bill sounds, that there are certainly some agendas attached to it. So we would encourage people that are out there that are of legal mind, to have any opinions to offer this particular, the opposition on this bill. I would ensure that they simply contact our office, and that we would certainly look forward to their advice. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 151, the Personal Property Security Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Agreed. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 133, the Legislative Assembly Election Dates Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to respond to Bill number 133, the Legislative Assembly Election Dates Amendment Act here today, Mr. Speaker. And of course, this bill is necessitated by the games that have been played by the Premier and the Sask Party government with respect to our democratic process, Mr. Speaker. And here we have a government that's extending their mandate, that's choosing a date that aligns at the same time as municipal elections all across the province, Mr. Speaker, not doing justice to the important democratic process that people deserve in the province. And it's interesting, Mr. Speaker, because of course we have a Premier that's unelected by the people of Saskatchewan as Premier in that role. He was elected, yes, Mr. Speaker, by members of the Sask Party, Mr. Speaker, but unelected by Saskatchewan people, and no mandate, Mr. Speaker, on this front. And when we think of elections, Mr. Speaker, I know many people look back to that last election, Mr. Speaker, and they look back to the bill of goods that they were sold by the then Premier, Mr. Speaker, and the Sask Party at the time, Mr. Speaker. And the fact of the matter is they just weren't straight with Saskatchewan people on front after front after front. They weren't straight when it comes to the state of our finances, Mr. Speaker, hiding the massive billion-dollar-plus deficit that they had created. Of course, they hid the budget from Saskatchewan people. They weren't straight about their desperate sell-off attempts when it comes to our Crown corporations, the privatization schemes, Mr. Speaker, of the Sask Party government, Mr. Speaker. And they weren't straight with Saskatchewan people when it comes to the doubling of the PST that Saskatchewan people would need to pay to this government to pay for the mismanagement of the Sask Party government, Mr. Speaker. And if you think of that, Mr. Speaker, this is there was a then Premier and a leader of the Sask Party who ran on not hiking taxes, and then shortly after, Whammo did the exact opposite and doubled the take of PST in Saskatchewan with a hike and with an expansion. And as a result of that, we have an economy that's hurting, Mr. Speaker. We have household economies that are hurting, families that are hurting to pay the bills, Mr. Speaker, job loss across our province, a construction sector that's left reeling, Mr. Speaker, on this front, companies that have been devastated, entrepreneurs that have taken on risks, stepped up and created jobs that are left holding the bag for the bad decisions of the Sask Party government. And of course, in that last election, the Sask Party wasn't straight with Saskatchewan people about the attacks, the indecent attacks on the most vulnerable within this province, Mr. Speaker. So I guess from a partisan self-interest, I could see why this Premier with no mandate and that crew with a big majority, why they're hiding from accountability with Saskatchewan people and extending their mandate, Mr. Speaker, and choosing a date at an inopportune time. But I say shame on them, because at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, it's incumbent on all of us in this Assembly, whether in opposition or in government, to serve the public's interest. It's not about the partisan interest. Far too often what we're seeing with the Sask Party government is that it's all about their own partisan interest or their self-interest on that front, Mr. Speaker, and not about the public's interest. So we call on the government to come to their senses, to give the municipalities and those that serve at that level and that will be pursuing service at that level their time and their space. We're calling on this government to move forward the election into the spring of that year, Mr. Speaker, the provincial election, to ensure a good, clear conversation with Saskatchewan people. And we condemn this Premier who doesn't have a mandate, who hasn't been elected by Saskatchewan people to serve as the Premier, Mr. Speaker, to stop hiding from accountability with Saskatchewan people and to be prepared for that election and that accountability. We're all working to build towards that as Saskatchewan, as the official opposition, Saskatchewan New Democrats. We've been working and building all across Saskatchewan. That work will continue, and it's in earnest. It's about building a better future for all in this province, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be ready to go come election time. But the fact of the matter is that the games that the Sask Party's playing on this front just aren't good enough. And I see the member, a good person, a good hockey player, I'm told, a good person who's sort of mocking from his seat, Mr. Speaker, from Kindersley. And, that's sort of an interesting point around this, Mr. Speaker, because I think of the former member who represented Kindersley in that last election, Mr. Speaker, and I kind of wonder, well, where is Bill Boyd now, Mr. Speaker? Because clearly in that election, Bill Boyd, Brad Wall, and the Sask Party weren't straight with Saskatchewan people. In the case of the member from Kindersley, he went to the voters, Mr. Speaker, at a time where he was embroiled in scandal, Mr. Speaker, and presided over mismanaged project after mismanaged project that put our finances off the rails and that are making Saskatchewan people pay a real cost for that mismanagement, Mr. Speaker. And then shortly after that election and all the broken promises, well, where did that member end up, Mr. Speaker? Well, he's certainly not in this Assembly anymore, Mr. Speaker. So we'll see if that continued sort of arrogance and dismissal of Saskatchewan people will work for the Sask Party, but all we can control is our own actions, and we're going to continue to work to build Saskatchewan as the official opposition Saskatchewan New Democrats in earnest, Mr. Speaker. So at this point in time, with respect to Bill number 133, I'll adjourn debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Voigt.
As the member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into the debate on Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018. The Local Government Election Act, Mr. Speaker, is responsible or governs all local elections in our province. It includes elections for the mayor, the reeve, councillors, and all types of municipalities, including cities, towns, villages, rural municipalities, and northern municipalities. And it also governs school board elections, which are usually conducted by municipalities on behalf of the school division. Mr. Speaker, this bill builds on the bill to which my colleague from Regina Rosemont just spoke to, Bill number 133. This involves the setting the dates for municipal and school board elections for November 9th, 2020, and the second Wednesday, November, for each election thereafter. So this bill comes out of the challenges of a government who had a set election date for both municipal and provincial elections that overlapped. So this is the government's proposal for solving that overlap, which would have just been days, but it is now weeks, Mr. Speaker, about 2 weeks, which I would argue isn't much better. The fact of the matter is, when we talk about engagement and democracy and wanting people to participate, there will be a considerable amount of voter fatigue, and I think this is a government who perhaps wants to take advantage of that. Rather than thinking about how we might be able to best do this to fully engage citizens in Saskatchewan, a good proposal had come forward that we should be moving the provincial election 6 months earlier to the spring of 2020, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting, in the minister's second reading comments, he commented basically that he thanked the municipal and education sector stakeholders for their patience and their thoughtful consideration of the past few months of the various options to address the proximity of those two elections, Mr. Speaker. So he thanked the stakeholders, but usually when there is cooperation or endorsement of a idea, a minister in a second reading speech will make those comments. This is quite clear to me that most of those stakeholders, there may be one or two perhaps that one could find, but I don't believe that stakeholders think that having these two elections in such close proximity is a good idea. So we will be having a provincial election. It's interesting, just a side note, when this bill was just introduced in the House, the government, via Twitter actually said, it's official, the election, the provincial election will be on October 26, 2020. Well, I know you know this, Mr. Speaker, but maybe the people at home don't know this. It's not official until this bill passes in the spring, assuming that it does pass, Mr. Speaker, and does pass perhaps without amendment. I know that I'm hearing from people who think that having these two elections overlap isn't a great idea for our democracy. One thing to note is this is a government who was quite proud of having set election dates, Mr. Speaker, and in my time in this House, we haven't yet had an election on those set election dates, and assuming that I have the privilege of being nominated to serve in Saskatoon or to run in Saskatoon-Riversdale, again, the case will be, it will be the same case where we aren't keeping to the same fixed election date that this government had committed. So in essence, in my time in this legislature, if this bill passes after close scrutiny and feedback from folks, this government will have eked out an extra year of basically of time in office between the last election, because in 2016, when the election was in the spring of 2016, the set election date had actually been set for the fall of 2015, and because there was an overlap with the provincial and federal elections, the provincial government, the Sask party at that point, the election was bumped forward to the spring, so they got an extra 6 months then, and we'll be doing the same thing here, Mr. Speaker. So this is a government who was very proud and took great credit for set election dates, but has managed to extend its mandate without going to the people, Mr. Speaker. Again, 2 weeks, going from just a few days to 2 weeks, I would argue is not going to solve any problems, Mr. Speaker. I know my one colleague had said, oh, a few days is better than, or a couple weeks may be marginally better than a few days, but I would argue that it isn't. Any of us who've been on the doorstep, Mr. Speaker, when there is election overlap, people, believe it or not, get tired of seeing and hearing from politicians. They tune out a little bit, and I think that's incredibly unfortunate. What we do in this place, or what municipal councils do, those are all really important things. Those, and in fact, actually, municipal leaders or municipalities are a creature of the province. They, despite the really great work that they do, despite how they are the level of government that is right there and the day-to-day with folks, they are a creature of what the province chooses to do, Mr. Speaker. And what I'm hearing from folks is that this is not a good idea to have these elections overlap. I will hopefully down the road get an opportunity to talk to its companion bill, Bill number 133. But that's not the case here today. I just want to point out that aside from changing the election dates, what this bill also does, Mr. Speaker, Bill number 134, it makes corrections to errors in the 2015 amendments to the Local Government Election Amendment Act, and it also allows residents who live on land that is annexed by another municipality less than 3 months before an election to vote in their new municipality in local elections. And the bill also authorizes council and school board to use different forms of posting notices, but the real big piece here is changing the election dates, and not in any real significant fashion. As my colleague pointed out, we have a premier who was elected as an MLA for his constituency and as a leader of his party by just a few thousand folks here in the province, Mr. Speaker. One could argue that he doesn't have a mandate by the province of Saskatchewan, and what this government is choosing to do is to, again, squeak out an extra 6 months of governing, Mr. Speaker, which has not necessarily been great for the people of Saskatchewan. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I, for now, would like to move to adjourn Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure again to rise to speak to Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act. Again, this is a partner to the previous two bills, and it does a few things here, Mr. Speaker. Bill 135, it's always good to take a look at the minister's second reading remarks just to see where the government is coming from when it comes to their perspective on the bill. The minister points out that this bill makes an amendment to one bilingual act, the Education Act 1995, as a result of the introduction of the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018, to which I just spoke. And the proposed amendment, the minister says, responds to a request from Saskatchewan School Boards Association by providing authority for school boards to require a candidate to submit a criminal record check as part of the nomination process. It's interesting here that they're listening to the proposal by the Saskatchewan School Boards Association that they would have heard in their consultations, Mr. Speaker, on this particular front, but quite possibly not listening to stakeholders on the significant overlap of the provincial and municipal elections. On face value, submitting a criminal record check as part of a nomination process, I think, is a good measure. I think it's also important to note that a criminal record shouldn't mean you don't get to run for office, and that should be up to the people of the constituency or of the area in which the person is running, Mr. Speaker, but it's a good thing that in terms of transparency to have all those kinds of things out in the open. Another amendment to the local Another amendment in this particular act requires that a criminal record check should be included with the nomination papers if the school board has passed such a resolution under the Education Act 1995. The minister points out that similar authority exists for municipalities in Saskatchewan. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that's all I have for now with Bill number 135, the Local Government Elections Consequential Amendment Act, and I move to adjourn debate.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act.
136.
Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018. Mr. Forbes.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I was half standing up and not standing up because I was prepared to speak about 136, but not 135, which of course my colleague from Saskatoon Riversdale just spoke to. I will enter into debate here today on Bill 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018. This bill replaces the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 1999. It outlines the procedures for the training of apprentices, journey persons, and tradespersons, regulates the apprenticeship system, adds 2 new categories that were not included for mandatory training in the previous bill, subtrade and occupation, introduces a mandatory certification trade and a certification-only trade, and introduces additional measures to enforce the previous regulations for employers who do not comply. When the minister was providing a second reading on this bill, he identified that there is an extensive system in the trades. We definitely appreciate this. There are a lot of different moving parts to be considered when you're looking at revising the entire system, and of course there can be unintended consequences that result from that. The minister goes through some length to explain how the changes came about and argues that they're industry-driven changes. There's also a discussion about the group of people that were brought together to engage in this consultation process. But I think that the impression is left from the minister's remarks that there is unanimous consensus in the changes that are being proposed in this bill. And I know that the minister knows that's certainly not the case. And I've heard from a number of folks within different industries that are quite concerned about the new language that's being added into this bill, and have described it as a watering down of the trades. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done in looking at these additional definitions that are being provided here about subtrade and occupation, and what the impact on the overall construction is going to be. If you consider a situation where a house is being built and everyone has one very tiny job, as opposed to bringing in an electrician to oversee the whole process. If you have the electrical jobs broken into 20 different jobs, and folks are coming in only to do their specialized piece, I'm sure you can appreciate the fact that the skilled work, the work relies on the previous work that was done, and there can be a lot of complications that result in these types of situations. So there's definitely cause for concern in the as these definitions have been identified here. Certainly, I think it is a good move for employers because they will effectively be able to hire folks for lower wages to go into some of these subcategories and do some of the work that is frankly costing them more money right now. So in this current climate where the PST has been added to construction labor by this government, already making construction labor a scarce resource. I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that the changes that are being presented in this bill add additional levels of challenges for folks who are out of work today and looking to provide for their families. So I certainly appreciate the amount of work that goes into consultation with industry and everything that went into this, but just wanted to add that there are some concerns with this particular piece of legislation as it relates to apprenticeship, and to make sure that I got those on the record, Mr. Speaker. I know my colleagues and the critic will have a lot more to add with this bill, but with that I would like to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 137. This is the Sask Energy Miscellaneous Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Sarr.
Recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise today to enter into the debate on Bill 137, which amends the Sask Energy Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is an extremely short bill, but that doesn't mean it's not an important one. This bill does a couple of things. First of all, it gives the Lieutenant Governor and Council a great deal of leeway in terms of what things are done by regulation. And as we learned from looking at the explanatory notes, as well as the corresponding section in the Sask Energy Act, the bill, quote here, it will allow the corporation to request an order in council to generally approve a program or initiative without the need for additional specific orders in council for every individual approved participant in such program. So Mr. Speaker, that's an interesting change, and what it potentially means is a lack of transparency. It means that Sask Energy could be entering into these deals without even the ability of the opposition to find out about these through orders in council, which the transparency process for finding orders in council is already quite difficult. So for a government that pledged to be the most transparent ever, making things less transparent, this change is a little concerning. The other change that makes this bill very important and frankly I suspect interesting to the public is that it's considerably increasing the debt limit, Mr. Speaker, from $1.7 billion all the way up to $2.5 billion. So that's increasing the borrowing limit for Sask Energy by $800 million, which is almost a 50% increase, Mr. Speaker. Now, this is at a time when Sask Energy is, to our knowledge, quite profitable. I believe they've recently applied to have their rates actually reduced, their public consumption rates, Mr. Speaker. So it does raise a bit of an alarm when we see this government, a government that's done a poor job of maintaining debt at a manageable level. When we see this government basically asking for a very substantial increase to their to the limit on their credit card. There's a lot of concern for why this is happening. We haven't heard a lot of explanation from the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. It's confusing why Sask Energy would be increasing its borrowing limit through legislation at this time of the fiscal year. It's definitely going to be a question that I suspect that our critic will be asking in committee, Mr. Speaker. Now, it's quite interesting. If you look at Sask Energy's annual report, I think it provides a little more detail. When you look at the chair of Sask Energy in her message, Sask Energy in 2017 delivered some strong financial results, including $110 million in income before unrealized market value adjustments, which is a 12.2% consolidated return on equity and a strong debt-to-equity ratio. So that's great to see in their annual report, but it really introduces this question, Mr. Speaker, as to why the debt load of Sask Energy would be increased so much when Sask Energy is already doing so well financially. When we look back at the history of Sask Energy's net debt in 2013, it was $1.064 billion. 2014, it was $1.159 billion. 2015, it was $1.156. 2016, it was $1.210. And then in 2017, it's $1.232. So we have seen Sask Energy's debt going up quite steadily, but of course that's to be expected with inflation. What we don't expect to see, Mr. Speaker, is from the 2017 levels of their actual debt, this is asking for a credit limit doubling that. What their actual debt was in 2017 was 1.232, and this is asking for a credit limit of $2.5 billion. So that's a huge increase in their borrowing limit, and so we've got some substantial concerns about that, and we're wondering what that's all about. We're a little skeptical because we've got a government that doesn't seem to be able to be trusted to manage our finance. We've got a government here that has consistently increased our debt load, so this is concerning for us, Mr. Speaker. The timing of this bill also has also given us some question, because this is kind of midway through the year. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know that the province's debt has tripled in the last 10 years, and so this is definitely something that we are concerned about, and we will be digging into. With that, I don't think that I've got anything further to add, and so I would move to adjourn the debate on this bill, Mr. Speaker.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 138, the Miscellaneous Statutes Government Relations Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Pedersen.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure this afternoon to rise and enter into debate on Bill number 138, the Miscellaneous Statutes Government Relations Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, this is sort of several acts in one, or certainly a piece of legislation that that proposes changes to not just one act, but a whole list of them, and I'm going to read that into the record. We have not only the Amusement Ride Safety Act and the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Act, both of 1999. We also have the Electrical Licensing Act, the Fire Safety Act, the Gas Licensing Act, the Passenger and Freight Elevator Act, the Technical Safety Authority of Saskatchewan Act, and the Uniform Building and Accessibility Standards Act. So, Mr. Speaker, these are pieces of legislation that govern our everyday lives, and when things are going well, none of us would have reason probably to think of them. I know every once in a while you get on an elevator and notice the certificate in that elevator, and probably, if you think about it a little bit, are happy that the inspections are happening on a regular basis. But it's often, as I said, something that we don't think about until there's an anomaly, until there's some sort of a disaster. And certainly that is often the case with regulations such as these. I have to admit to not being an expert in really any of these areas, so I had to do a little bit of research. Looking at the Amusement Ride Safety Act, the likelihood that something would go wrong on an amusement ride, although I think they're built to make you feel like it could go wrong at any time, is actually very, very small. Of course, I think most of us would remember a disaster that happened at the West Edmonton Mall. It doesn't seem like that long ago, but I'm going to bet that it's way longer than I imagine it to be right now, because I think I was a child at the time. But it was one of those accidents that made you think a little bit about who was inspecting the rides and how safe it was, and every time a bolt rattled when you were at the fair, Mr. Speaker, it made your heart jump a little bit more. So certainly as a child that was a case. I know hitting the Weyburn Fair every summer, being on the zipper and the tilt-a-whirl, you wanted to know that those inspections were being done and that the oversight was in place so that companies were compliant with those standards. And as a parent, I just had opportunity this summer to be back at the Weyburn Fair with both my youngest daughter and my niece. Again, reminded, as you're up on the rides, how quickly those rides are set up and how much you really put your safety in the hands of folks who are putting that equipment up in the middle of the night. And it's a pretty big leap of faith, I suppose, Mr. Speaker. So I looked up, how likely is it that someone would be injured on one of these rides? The odds, for those who play the lottery, the odds of being seriously injured on an amusement park ride in the U.S., so I would assume a similar level of risk in Canada, these rides often follow similar paths, is 1 in 16 million. So that's actually pretty good odds. Just for comparison's sake, your odds of being hit by a bolt of lightning are 1 in 775,000. So being hurt on an amusement ride, you have way better odds, I think, of winning your average lottery. And I noticed there's a big jackpot on the billboards today. So maybe that's the case. But that said, it is precisely because of inspections, because of legislation, because of acts such as this, I think, that do go a long ways towards ensuring that type of safety. And certainly, if you're putting yourself or you're putting your babies on those rides, you want to know that that the legislation governing that ride is being looked at and being updated on a regular basis, and that there's some mechanism for enforcement for that legislation. So I understand that that is the lens that was applied. I know the minister, when he got up on second reading speeches, gave a fairly robust explanation of why we were seeing all of these amendments to these various public safety pieces of legislation. I believe that he said in his opening second reading remarks that this bill, if passed, will amend 8 public and technical safety statutes, all of those for which the the Ministry of Government Relations is responsible. And again, these are all statutes that have application to public safety issues. So that was the lens that was applied when looking at these acts. I understand from the minister's second reading comments that there was a desire to apply some uniformity to these various acts, making them consistent across the statute, so that the authority, the wording, and the penalty amounts and procedures were more uniform. I understand that prior to with the existing legislation, there is some variance, or a great deal of variance with regard to those various measures. The minister also noted that the goal of this piece of legislation was to add more effective enforcement measures, such as administrative penalties, discipline orders, and public notices, and that these would allow for a more flexible and responsive approach in dealing with non-compliance and safety issues. So a bit contradictory or curious, I guess. On one hand, you have a goal of being uniformity amongst these various pieces of legislation. On the other hand, flexibility and responsiveness. But I'll get into that a little bit more, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Inspector, there are some pieces with regard to authority. For example, in the existing legislation, the Passenger and Freight Elevator Act lacks the authority for a chief inspector to issue compliance orders. So with the changes proposed in this bill, it would allow that authority to be uniform across each of these statutes. And another thing that was mentioned by the minister was that only 2 of the other acts allow the government to apply to the court to enforce a compliance order. So what was missing, or what is currently missing, is the ability. He didn't specify which acts those were, but you could have a compliance order, but the government didn't have the right to apply to the courts for compliance. So that does seem to be a reasonable addition. If you have a compliance order, if you have concerns leading up to a compliance order about something that impacts public safety, it does seem reasonable that you would be able to apply to the courts to have that enforced. I think members of the public would certainly be interested in making sure that if there are serious concerns, serious enough to issue that compliance order, that there is some effective mechanism of enforcement. One thing that the minister noted as well, and we've seen this with a number of other pieces of legislation, is an increase in the fines. In this case, up to $25,000 for an individual, and I believe it's $200,000 for a corporation. Something, again, that we've seen as legislation has been updated. The minister noted that high penalties are a deterrent for those who care little for public safety. I'm sure the critic will have some time in committee to to talk about the evidence for that and how the numbers were arrived at. Another thing that I suspect will make its way into committee or into questions by the critic would be around the assertion by the minister that the bill has a focus more on compliance and safety than on punishment. Those two things seem to be a bit contradictory, but again, I'm sure that's something that the critic will want to look a little more closely into. Looking at the administrative penalties and discipline orders, if this bill were to pass, would allow the chief officials within the ministry to apply fines or require corrective action such as additional training or reporting to address contravention and non-compliance issues. So in some cases it may be a fine, in some it may be an order to require the company to implement a training program for their staff. And again, I think it's just a reasonable question to ask about the evidence that there is for each of these measures and how they do promote public safety, which of course is the goal of all members here and certainly is something that the public would expect us to be very vigilant about. Speaking of that, another one of the acts that was mentioned in the legislation was the Boiler Act, and I couldn't help, after looking at the amusement rides odds of injury, wondering how often it is the case that you see members of the public injured by exploding boilers. In North America, the most recent example I could find was that in 2017 there was a pulp mill explosion due to a boiler malfunction in Peace River. Fortunately, there were no injuries at that time, but it did disrupt for a short time the mill there. A more serious instance was back in 2009, where one person was killed and 3 were injured inside a public works power plant when a boiler exploded. The Cliff Power Plant, interestingly, operated by Public Works and Government Services. So this was a publicly run building power plant that had some issues with inspection and did result in this fatal explosion. So just to show that although the risks in these instances may be rather small, it is important that they are accounted for, and that we endeavor to ensure that this legislation is updated and using best practice, best evidence, and always ensuring that we have the goal of public safety in our sites. So I think that it does seem very reasonable that we would be looking at these statutes, and that they might need some modernization and a second look, as we ought to be doing again in all instances that deal with matters of the public, especially matters of public safety. And I would add, certainly any time we're putting children on things like amusement rides, we want to make sure that there's a proper amount of oversight. I suggested some of the areas that my colleague may have with regard to questions for the minister, but I think that I have come to the end of my comments and my questions. So with that, I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 138.
Members move to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Sarr.
Recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
It's my honour to rise to participate in this debate, Mr. Speaker. This bill is about amending the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Act, and as I'm sure you know, Mr. Speaker, foreign workers have played an important role in Saskatchewan's economy throughout the history of this province. We going all the way back, to Chinese immigrants, and which are covered in the tunnels in Moose Jaw tour. Unfortunately, foreign workers have often been a very vulnerable group and have been subject to some abuses, and so it's very important to have legislation protecting their rights and ensuring that the program for having foreign workers here is properly administered and enforced. This bill changes the procedures for hearings and appeals for people that might be charged under the Act or have some dispute under the Act. It also allows for the sharing of information between some government institutions when it comes to inspections, investigations, and enforcement. Mr. Speaker, we believe that there should be more focus on actually addressing violations of the Act made by foreign worker recruiters and employers. That's a part that seems to be missing here. We know that the number of investigators isn't something to be covered in legislation, but this seems to be an ongoing theme where we don't have enough investigators to look into the breaches of legislation. And it's easy for the legislature to make laws, but if executive government doesn't actually hire enough investigators and enforcement personnel to actually make sure that those laws are enforced, then just simply having the laws on the books doesn't do a whole lot of good. I'm sure we can all think of examples in the past where the issue of temporary foreign workers being abused has been in the media, whether that was dealing with Tim Hortons, I think that was in Weyburn if I recall correctly, or Brighton View at the GTH. There's been questions raised in the media about whether these employers were dealing with their workers in a proper fashion. We would like to, I guess I'm wondering what is being done to enforce the regulation of foreign workers employed in the seasonal agricultural worker program in the province. Now, I know that this has been an important program for farmers in this province. In the industry in which my family participates, beekeeping, seasonal workers have often occupied across Saskatchewan, have often occupied an important role in providing seasonal agricultural needs, and I know that's not unique to the honey industry. But we'd like to know what is being done to make sure that that workers are both being able to be recruited, but also being protected. We'd also like to know what's being done to improve the knowledge of foreign workers of what their rights are under the Act, and to raise awareness about the protection measures offered by this Act to workers throughout the province. A question that I have, Mr. Speaker, is just what ability a worker has to be able to look for new employment with an employer who might also require temporary foreign workers if the worker's current employer is not complying with the legislation. If the worker's only remedy is to report it to the ministry, but ultimately if it looks like they're going to be sent back to their home country, that practically speaking, what that results in is that temporary foreign worker isn't going to report any breach of the Act because they don't want to get sent home. And so it increases the risk to those foreign workers of being subjected to abusive practices. With that, Mr. Speaker, I think I will wrap up my comments on this bill and move that debate on this bill be adjourned.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 140, the Animal Health Act. Mr. Forbes.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Hey, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Good to take my place in this Assembly and join debates on the Animal Health Act. Again, Mr. Speaker, I was in talking with one of my colleagues about this before. She was wondering, like, so are you going to come out in favor of animal health? And I just want to clear that up right off the bat. Yes. Hard yes. Also, you know, I'm always been a big fan of motherhood and apple pie as well. Just in case there's any sort of question about that. But in all seriousness, Mr. Speaker, in following the debate thus far in the Assembly, and looking over the legislation itself and looking over the terms, it seems to be fairly straightforward in terms of what is proclaimed here and striking that balance between in animal health matters that range from how the health of livestock on the farm are being treated, right down to my cat Petunia, Mr. Speaker. So in terms of that broad scope that needs to incorporate all these different sort of circumstances and complexities into a durable and broad application of legislation around promoting animal health, the legislation would seem to be fairly straightforward. And again, in all seriousness, Mr. Speaker, would seem to promote animal health as is set out by the legislation itself. In terms of the way that these powers that are enshrined in the Act and some of the consolidation that's gone on with the Act itself, Mr. Speaker, we'll certainly have more questions to be asked at the committee stage of this legislation. I'll certainly be looking to our critic, the member from Regina Northeast, in terms of what has to be said there. But, Mr. Speaker, again, we recognize that there are a great many interests and circumstances to be incorporated in this piece of legislation. We'll also be interested to see how this you know, passes muster or not with the relevant stakeholders. And again, which would seem to be a straightforward matter, when you get it out to the stakeholders, sometimes appears to be not as such, Mr. Speaker. So I know that there have been different efforts made over the years to update animal health legislation, and again, different of those circumstances and the complexities that arise, perhaps not as well thought through as they should be. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, that's not, that doesn't excuse inertia, that doesn't excuse a lack of progress in promoting and defending animal health. And I know that in other circumstances, you know, within the past few years, Mr. Speaker, there's been legislation brought forward by this government where I think the ranking of Saskatchewan's animal health protection regime came in for some fairly low grades right across the country, Mr. Speaker. And in terms of, you know, where this once implemented and once updated, where this legislation will put us in that ranking. Of course, you know, those comparators being critical to public policy. Where will this leave Saskatchewan in terms of standing up for animal health? Will it move us from the cellar of the rankings, which is where I believe we currently are, Mr. Speaker, to something more resembling a leadership role, which again is something that we should all want. Be it those entrusted with the well-being of animals at the farm gate, or again right at in the home fires and you know, the animals that are practically part of our family, Mr. Speaker. So in terms of those that wide range of interests and how this legislation covers those off, in terms of how this learns from best practices and legislation and effective animal health regimes in other jurisdictions, we'll be looking for greater sort of indication on that front, Mr. Speaker. We'll be looking to the stakeholders for them to not just have their nominal interests reported out in a second reading speech on the part of the minister, but we'll be looking for further confirmation of those interests by the stakeholders themselves, Mr. Speaker. And at the end of the day, does this improve the lot of animal health and welfare in the province of Saskatchewan or not? And we'll again be looking for better indications on that front, both in the committee stage, but also through the good work of other members on this side and through our critics. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 140, an act respecting animal health and the prevention, control, and eradication of diseases among animals, 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
In orders, adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 142, the Proceedings Against the Crown Act 2018. Mr. McCall.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today and enter into adjourned debates on Bill number 142, an act respecting proceedings against the Crown and making consequential amendments to other acts. There are no explanatory notes that have been provided with this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, because what's happening here is that the government is proposing that we repeal and replace the Proceedings Against the Crown Act with this new piece of legislation, and the other piece of legislation, which probably to no surprise I will be speaking about right after this. So this bill provides a regulatory framework for the conduct of proceedings against the Crown. So it's putting all of these regulations, some of which were previously understood through common law, into one place, which is definitely useful. The bill replaces entirely replaces the existing legislation. So you sort of have to compare the two bills to see what all the differences are. There were some sections that were removed from the previous version of the Act. It's quite complex. It adds a new section on the conduct of a trial without a jury. The new bill also includes a French version as part of the effort to create bilingual legislation and make sure we're modernizing our legislation. We are going to be carefully looking through this, of course, because there can be a tremendous impact on proceedings against the Crown and how they end up looking as a result of these changes. So I know that my colleague, the critic for justice, will be spending a lot of time going through this in detail as well. And we're lucky as well in addition to having useful caucus staff who will pour through these legislation and help us out. There are also a number of people that have backgrounds in the legal profession here that can provide some insights, which is helpful when you're going through legislation, Mr. Speaker. So when the minister was doing a second reading on this bill, he talked about the fact that it was becoming bilingual. He talked also about removing the option for jury trials and proceedings against the Crown, and how rare it is that these jury trials exist, and that Saskatchewan is sort of the last holdout that still at this point allows for jury trials against the Crown outside of New Brunswick. So certainly in favor of getting us in line with other provinces. It makes sense that these would be quite complex trials, and it would be very cumbersome for folks to participate in a jury for what can be extended periods of time for this effort. And on this side of the House, we're always quite interested in looking what other provinces are doing and making sure we're in line with other provinces. In fact, our questioning in question period frequently uses this as a point of evidence, and we look at what the indicators are for other provinces, and so it's certainly useful to see when folks are proposing something that will get us in line. The minister also talks about the fact that these can be complex cases, and that this new act includes some minor clarifications and improvements on who can attend questioning, how default judgments can be entered, and how orders can be stayed pending an appeal. So really, the complexities in terms of how the proceedings against the Crown proceed. And so it's also been translated into French, as the minister says, and modernized. I think I've probably at this point said much more than the minister has said when he was introducing this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, but I'm going to allow my other colleagues to weigh in further on the ramifications of some of these changes and what the consequences will be. We're certainly going to be taking a very close look at this piece of legislation, and with that I will move that we adjourn second reading of Bill number 142, the Proceedings Against the Crown Act 2018. Sure.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 14, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 143, the Proceedings Against the Crown Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Mr. McCall.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 143, the Proceedings Against the Crown Consequential Amendments Act 2018.
Yes.
Of course, we know that I was just up discussing Bill number 142, and we know that anytime we have a Consequential Amendments Act, we're talking about other pieces of legislation that need to change as a result of this piece of legislation changing. So that's what Bill 143 is all about. When the minister gave his second reading speech on Bill number 143, he talked about the fact that it was being replaced with bilingual statutes, but also indicated that there is no change to any of the substance of any of the acts as a result of this. It's just to make sure that all of the acts line up when they're referencing one another and are in line with one another. So, in line with this, the changes are in result of the proceedings against the Crown, and we know that there are a number of changes that are being proposed as this bill goes hand in hand with Bill number 142. Some of the notable ones being the fact that there is a regulatory framework for the conduct of proceedings against the Crown, and that it introduces amendments to certain acts that result from those amendments. So we will also be making sure that we do our due diligence on this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. But with that, I will move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 143.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Here.
Government orders. Adjourn debates. Item number 15. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon, Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to wade into debate on Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018. This bill, I always find that it's good to look at the minister's second reading speeches. Obviously, you've got the legislation to look at, but the second reading speech is a good place to start in terms of getting a sense of where the government says it's coming from with respect to legislation. And the minister, in his comments here, points out that this particular bill will support the efficient regulation of realtors by the Saskatchewan Real Estate Commission. I think it's important to note that this bill, the minister also mentions that it was first enacted in 1995, and it's always good to revisit legislation that hasn't been amended in recent years. 20 plus years is a long time. A lot has changed in those 20 odd years, Mr. Speaker, including the use now of technology and electronic signatures and basically the fact that we all carry a personal computer in our hands for that matter, Mr. Speaker. Whenever I look at bills, too, one of the things that I like to first ask questions about is who asked for these changes, who is supporting these changes, and the minister in his second reading speech points out that the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority worked with the Saskatchewan Real Estate Commission and the Association of Saskatchewan Realtors to come up with these amendments, and the minister points out that he looks forward to continuing collaboration to develop the regulations. So I know that our critic, when it comes time for this bill to go to committee, will have an opportunity to ask a little bit more about that, and our job here in the intervening months between now and the time that it goes to committee and is passed is to chat with stakeholders about their thoughts and perspectives. Is everything that came out of consultation and collaboration, is that how the bill ended up? Is that really what folks were asking for? And it very well may be, but it's important to make sure that those perspectives are heard, Mr. Speaker. So this particular bill, Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act, this act provides for a hybrid model of regulation of realtors with the semi-autonomous, the Saskatchewan Real Estate Commission, and oversight by the Superintendent of Real Estate, who happens to be an official of the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority of Saskatchewan. And these particular amendments are important for the ministers pointing out for a number of reasons. The purchase of a house is a big deal, Mr. Speaker. It's probably the largest purchase that those of us who many Saskatchewan families, it will be the largest purchase that they make in their life. And I know even from my perspective, I think I bought my first house in 1995, actually when this bill was enacted, I think, and I actually haven't done a lot of real estate interactions in that time, Mr. Speaker, but just this last spring I bought a new house. I moved from just a couple blocks away from my parents to just across the street, but I was amazed sitting down with a real estate agent in fact, how much technology has impacted this particular profession. And I remember in 1995 signing a stack of documents and it taking a great deal of time, and then having my real estate agent here just this last spring when I made an offer on a house, pulling everything up on a screen, and it was quite remarkable, actually. But this is an important purchase in many people's lives, and it's important that those who help us buy and sell houses have the tools that they need, and those tools are properly regulated, Mr. Speaker. So the Minister in his comments points out that these amendments will provide the Saskatchewan Real Estate Commission with improved and expanded enforcement options. He says that a new section authorizing special penalties will allow the Commission to efficiently impose penalties for technical violations. The specific contraventions and specific penalty amounts will be set out in regulations. So in committee, I'm sure that that'll be a discussion that the critic responsible for this will have with the Minister. He also points out that the penalty amounts that can be imposed by hearing committees are being increased from $5,000 to $25,000 for each individual finding, and from $15,000 to $100,000 for the aggregate maximum for all findings, Mr. Speaker. So again, some questions will be how those particular numbers were arrived at, how they perhaps match up to other jurisdictions. The Minister points out that this legislation will also revise bylaw-making powers to authorize the Commission to make administrative bylaws respecting the conduct of its affairs without the need for prior approval of those bylaws by the Superintendent of Real Estate. The more substantive bylaw-making powers will continue to require Superintendent approval, Mr. Speaker. He also points out that a new bylaw-making power will also be added respecting the use of electronic signatures and how those signatures can be witnessed. And the Minister argues that this will support increased efficiency for realtors. So that takes me back to the spring and all the electronic, how things have moved in the 20-some years since I first bought a house, Mr. Speaker. These amendments also include a series of other changes to clarify and expand the appeal process, to improve reporting and record-keeping requirements, and to support increased representation from farm real estate industry, Mr. Speaker. So on face value, this looks like a reasonable bill, and I know that our critic in committee will have many questions. Again, what I always think about, I know the Minister in his remarks talked about collaboration, and I think that that is, when it comes to bill making and policy making, the best policy and the best legislation comes from connecting with those who are impacted by legislation, in all the ways that people can be impacted by legislation, Mr. Speaker, and to make sure that those voices are heard and reflected well in legislation. So it'll be interesting to hear in committee if that was the case, Mr. Speaker. But for today, I think that that will conclude my remarks on Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018, and I move to adjourn debate.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act 2018. Ms. Sarr.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Glad to join the debate this afternoon on Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act. Again, Mr. Speaker, it's always sort of hard to tell what's modernization with this government, what's what's the sort of surreptitious angle that might be being seized upon in a given piece of legislation, and what is legitimately about modernizing and bringing a given piece of legislation into the present era. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, in the Minister's second reading speech, talks about how the Residential Services Act was last reviewed in 1985. That would seem to cry out there's been a lot that has changed in terms of the standard of care and the expectations that we have for residential services. And again, these are generally facilities or residential situations where the individuals are not able to independently care for themselves, to quote the minister's second reading speech, due to family circumstance, age, disability, or illness. So, Mr. Speaker, in terms of what the oversight review or what the oversight regime is for relevant facilities, it's important that we take a close look at that legislation and again take it out to the stakeholders, make sure that what is proclaimed as one thing is in fact that thing, Mr. Speaker. And it'll be interesting to see what sort of responses the minister has in committee, where I'm sure we'll be pursuing questions about what this does to the standard of care, what this does to the relationship of in various of these homes to the broader provincial system, Mr. Speaker. The line between what is public, what is private, what is more a matter of regulation versus the responsibilities that exist when a facility is within the public realm. And again, Mr. Speaker, to make certain that there isn't some kind of surreptitious privatization going on with this piece of legislation. What happens to the workers involved, Mr. Speaker, is another question that we'll be pursuing. But again, we will be looking at this very closely. We'll be doing our due diligence with stakeholders, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure we'll have a lively line of inquiry at the committee stage of this particular piece of legislation to make absolute certain that things are as they are proclaimed to be, Mr. Speaker. But with that, I know that other of my colleagues will have more and better informed things to say on this particular piece of legislation than I. But again, this is a piece of legislation where some of the most awesome responsibilities on the part of a government are writ in black and white in terms of legislation and in terms of responsibilities as how they play out in real life, Mr. Speaker. Because again, in terms of how this relates to the care of the vulnerable and people that are in the care, under the care of the state, it's again, we've got lots of examples through history, Mr. Speaker, where this can go very wrong. And indeed, some of those examples are on offer in our own province. And Mr. Speaker, it's legislation that is very important to get right, and then to understand very precisely how the legislation relates to the regulations and what the impacts are of each component of the regime. But Mr. Speaker, I'll not pursue it any further than that for today. And I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Belanger.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my honor to be able to rise in the House today and speak to Bill 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act. And there's a significant number of changes that are being proposed in this bill. Many are housekeeping, and many are reflective of changes in the industry that require changes in the Act. And as you know, as technology evolves, as regulatory enforcement evolves, then changes are required. A few new definitions have now been inserted or being proposed in this bill. Some changes, really, I think, semantical changes to things like the definition of illegal gas and illegal oil. There's a new definition for a drainage area. So that's something I think that is cleaning up and adding some depth, no pun intended, to this bill. Section 6 is being removed entirely. And where is that here? And substituted with a brand new clause that's much more detailed in terms of the jurisdiction and authority of the minister. If you look at the explanatory notes for this section, basically it's indicating it's supposed to provide greater clarity to the jurisdiction and authority of the minister. It certainly is longer, but Mr. Speaker, I suppose the clarity is one that will be understood more by officials than anyone else who's having to look at this clause. Then we go into some changes later on around section 7.9, which is now being amended, and again it has to do with immunity rather than the non-liability of the board. So basically the board itself is immune from liability, and this board that we're speaking of, just want to make sure I have the right reference. This is the Oil and Gas Conservation Board. They play a very important role in terms of monitoring and regulating the development of oil and gas in the province. So that's an important change. There's a lot of amendments in terms of references, including references to orders made under the Act, not just the regulations in the Act itself. So those are sprinkled throughout in terms of the amendments that are being done. And the entire first part of the inspections clause, which is section 17 in the current Act, is being also amended quite significantly, and I think particularly 1705 sub 3 looks like it's been, well actually it's quite similar, but for some reason they've removed the whole thing and replaced it, although I don't think the changes are really significant. Sub 4 is being removed or replaced as well, and a lot of these changes are taking out the reference to the minister and putting in a reference to an inspector, because I think the justification there is that it is the inspectors that are doing the actual work. For example, changes to 17.051, again, taking out the reference to the minister and putting in the inspector. And Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering why in bills like this where we're making amendments that the numbering also isn't reflected. We have some very, I don't know what the word is, detailed level of numbering. There used to be like clause 17, but now there's clause 17.051. And then clause 17.052, clause 17.053, and it certainly would be helpful if the officials took the time to maybe reorganize the numbering for these bills so that they're certainly easier to refer to. So that perhaps that will happen the next time that this bill is reviewed, but it makes it rather difficult to keep on track when you have clause numbers that go into 3 digits, Mr. Speaker. So that's just an observation. 17.1 is repealed altogether, and I just want to refer to the explanatory notes for that one, Mr. Speaker. I think it's found on page 11 of the explanatory notes, and it basically says remove references to structure test hole and oil shale core hole, as these terms are no longer, sorry, that's 17.01. I'm sad to see something like an oil shale core hole as no longer relevant. It's I don't know why, and I guess that's something we can ask in committee, but it kind of has a certain flair to an oil shale core hole or a structure test hole, and apparently they're redundant because they're no longer used in the industry. But there's a certain elan to that phrase, and we'll have to ask in committee about why it's being removed. 17.1, powers of the minister, is being, I have to find the reference here, in the 17.1 is being repealed. 17.1, sorry, I'm looking at 17 sub 1, and it's not 17.01 sub 1, it is 17.1. Here it is. this no longer required and is repealed because it provides all the authorities required to streamline the approval of plans used for increasing or improving oil or gas recovery or operations, and will allow for better I think it's supposed to say alignment, with current business practices. And again, Mr. Speaker, that is 17.1, and yet the explanatory note refers to 17 sub 1. So there's a bit of confusion there because it's not clear if that explanatory note refers to 17.1 or 17 sub 1, but at any rate, it's being repealed. So again, we'll have more questions in committee when we get to that subsection or section. Other minor changes that are being made throughout in relation to the items I've already discussed. I think the most important part of this bill, and certainly the changes that reflect what's going on in the world today, is a new part. And this is a new part 7.1, because there's a part 7 and a part 8. So we have to stick it in there somewhere. So it's the new part 7.1. And this is, I think, the most important part of the bill, and the minister certainly referred to it in her comments as something being necessary. And this is what happens when you get two different regulatory ministries looking after greenhouse gas emissions. Because we have the Ministry of the Environment responsible for pretty much all greenhouse gas emissions, except for those coming out of the oil and gas sector, Mr. Speaker, and you know, much has been said about prairie resilience and the plan to reduce emissions in the upstream oil and gas sector. This appears to be an effort to create a regulatory sphere for that that regulatory role for the Ministry of Energy and Resources to deal with emissions coming out of the greenhouse gas sector, or sorry, the upstream oil and gas sector. So there's I think some symmetry between this part and that which we find in the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act. But again, I think when you look at the split in regulatory authority, and we've talked about this before, it's really unfortunate that this is being hived off to a specific ministry and not being looked after by the Ministry of the Environment, who's generally responsible for this important effort to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But here we have it. So just I want to quickly describe this part 7.1, a little bit. There's a few definitions. Greenhouse gas, which I think is the same definition as we find in the Management Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act. There's also a new section 53.62, which will allow the Cabinet to make regulations for greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas sector. Specifying implementation dates and penalties. And again, Mr. Speaker, this is an important part of prairie resilience, and it's unfortunate that we're not getting advance notice here in the Assembly as to the nature of the regulations that the oil and gas sector will be looking at when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this is just, it's impossible to comment on. And I think we're going to have to ask a lot of questions in committee and then follow it very closely once the regulations are in effect. But again, we don't know what consultation has been done, who's being talked to, how these regulations will be structured, other than what we get in this proposed section here in our new part of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. For example, the new clause 53.63 sub 2 says the minister may use any indicators that the minister considers relevant in the preparation of a report. Well, Mr. Speaker, what does that mean? It's just so vague as to be almost meaningless, and until we know exactly what the minister will be considering relevant, he may consider nothing to be relevant, or she may consider nothing to be relevant. So it's very difficult to even have any decent debate about this because of the vagueness of the section. At least in 53.63 sub 3, we will get a report from the minister to the Legislative Assembly, so we will find out after the fact for sure what the minister did consider relevant. There's also an authority where the Section 53.64 allows the Minister of Energy and Resources to enter into agreements on behalf of the Government of Saskatchewan with the Government of Canada. So, but the Minister will need approval of Lieutenant Governor and Council. So at least there's some sort of checks and balances on the Minister here, but it's delegating the authority to enter into agreements to the Minister in relation to greenhouse gases in this sector, Mr. Speaker. Section 53.65 talks about the request for an investigation, and 53.66 allows the Minister to order an investigation following an application of an individual. And Mr. Speaker, I think that's reflective of what we see in the Management Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act. A few other changes. Currently, the fines are up to $500,000. They're now breaking that out. That's only for corporations. There's a new clause that will allow for fines to not more than $50,000 for individuals. One of my favorites, Mr. Speaker, since I've been elected, we've seen various bills dealing with gender neutrality, and there's actually a sneaky little he that remains in clause 62. They're getting rid of the he, and it will now say that person. So I don't know how many bills are left out there with actual gender references to the male gender, but we're still catching them, and I'm glad to see that they're being caught, Mr. Speaker, because gender neutral language has been around for a long time. So nice to see those changes being made. So, Mr. Speaker, I think without any sort of further technical briefing or some insight into what the Minister may consider relevant when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, we don't really have a lot to go on here. And this change, you know, it's supposed to help with prairie resilience. The Minister has said, she said, and this is from her speech, there'll be a fund that will be created, and we think it might go under the Management Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act fund, the technology fund, but we don't know because she wasn't very definite in her comments. She said, in the case of emission penalties, it could include payment to the technology fund. So a lot of questions there as well, Mr. Speaker. Talks about negotiating agreements with the Government of Canada for the methane emissions. As you know, Mr. Speaker, there have been federally introduced regulations in dealing with methane, and we know that under prairie resilience, the Minister of Environment has committed to making those changes. Unfortunately, it's not within his jurisdiction. It has to go to the Minister of Energy and Resources. So again, we have this split in terms of authorities, and hopefully the ministers are talking and communicating with each other so that we don't get inequities based on different ministries making the determinations. But at this point, Mr. Speaker, I think we have a lot of questions in committee, and others of my colleagues will want to speak to this bill. So I will move to adjourn the debate on Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 11, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 148, the Pipelines Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Bellin.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise again to speak to this bill, the Act to amend the Pipelines Act 1998. These two bills are kind of like the yin and yang in the oil and gas industry. We have the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, which deals with production, and of course the Pipelines Act, which deals with the transportation of oil and gas. And I know that there's been great efforts made by officials to align these two bills and make sure that they aren't disparate, because I think there's been a lot of efforts made along the road over the last several years, if not since 1998. This is basically allowing a few small changes. Minister can now get pipeline and flow line plans directly from the person who carried out the original survey. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but I think, as you know, Mr. Speaker, surveys are all digital now, and there isn't really a lot of difficulty in having the minister get them directly, so this will allow that. It changes some of the sanctions that we have and compliance requirements, where now administrative penalties can be used instead of instead of a penalty of other sorts. And then one of the important changes, and I think this is again reflective of the ongoing changes in the industry itself, is the establishment of IRIS as a legal online registry. And this is the Integrated Resource Information System that I know has been developed over the last few years by the ministry. And so I think if you were a person in the public trying to search locations of pipelines, I've tried it, it's really, really difficult. And I think you have to have a considerable amount of expertise to be able to even know where to look. And certainly, I remember when the Husky oil spill happened, Mr. Speaker, it was very, very difficult to find that particular pipeline license if you went into the system that was available. So it was really difficult, and I'm hoping that with the implementation of IRIS in this context as a legal online registry rather than a data system, then perhaps the searchability might become a little bit better. But I think the intent here, and I know IRIS, the work on IRIS has been going on for a long time. The intent here is for IRIS to become the sole legal record of the existence of the license as well as the terms and conditions applicable to that license. And Mr. Speaker, you know, there's been considerable work done by the auditor in terms of some of the accountability for pipelines in our province. A number of changes have been made in the past few years, and I think this is a continuation of that work. It's indicated here that the registry system is modeled after Saskatchewan's land title systems as well as other electronic registries operated by the Ministry for Oil and Gas Leases and Mineral Claims. It's not clear to me why the ISC system isn't being implemented or used entirely for this registry, because, as you know, Mr. Speaker, that's a corporation that has been doing a lot of good work in electronification, is that a word, of registries, and it seems that the ministry is going a different way on this proposal. So again, more questions in committee. Another piece I think that will be very helpful, and it has been helpful in the ISC land registry, is the establishment of a legal mechanism for the minister to acquire historical flow line and pipeline surveys directly from Saskatchewan land surveyors. And with the new online system, then all the modern GIS systems will also map those historic flow lines and pipelines. And so I think that kind of regulation, that kind of tracking of pipelines, I've heard that we've got 20,000 kilometers of pipelines in Saskatchewan. I've heard we've got 30,000 kilometers of pipelines in Saskatchewan. We've got a lot of pipelines, Mr. Speaker, and it's, I think, incredibly important for landowners. It's important for people that are tracking how pipelines are aging out and whether they're being replaced appropriately. And as you know, we've been calling on the government to implement best before date for pipelines, because that will facilitate not only safety for the province when we see the spills that have occurred, but also will help keep jobs in Saskatchewan with the steel and pipe production that the capacity that we currently have here in the province. So I think it's a win-win, but it's not something the government has actually jumped up and down and endorsed. So we will be able to, I hope, have both of these bills in committee at the same time, so there can be an understanding in terms of questions related to the two bills, the Conservation, Oil and Gas Conservation Act and the Pipelines Act. In many ways, they are the yin and yang of each other, so they really should maybe even be one bill, and I'm not sure if that's a proposal that the ministry is looking at or not, but we can certainly ask that at the time. So, Mr. Speaker, at this point, I think others will want to comment on this bill as well, and I will move that we adjourn the debate on Bill number 148, an act to amend the Pipelines Act of 1998.
Members move to adjourn debate. Does the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Oh, Recognized Government House Leader.
This House do now adjourn.
It's been moved move that the Assembly do now adjourn. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This assembly now stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.